The air was warm, sweet with the scent of blooming jasmine, yet a cold breath seemed to linger just beneath the golden light of summer. It was a beautiful season, the kind of summer where the sky stretches out in an endless, uninterrupted blue, and the evenings hold a soft, lingering warmth that makes you want to sit out on the porch just a little bit longer. Across the continent, ordinary people were simply trying to live their ordinary lives. In small, quiet villages, the focus was not on the grand, loud movements of nations, but on the simple, rhythmic tasks of the day. The weeding of a vegetable garden. The hanging of wet linen on a clothesline, watching it billow like white sails in the gentle breeze. The careful, quiet joy of watching children chase each other through tall, sunlit grass. But beneath this tranquil surface, a quiet, heavy weariness rested in the bones of the world. To understand how the shadows grew so long and so fast in those early days, we must look not to the march of steel, but to the quiet corners of the human heart. The world was deeply, profoundly tired. It had been only a single generation since the last great storm had swept across these very same fields, leaving scars that were still tender to the touch. The older men sitting on wooden benches in the town squares remembered. They carried the memory of rain-soaked trenches and shattered forests behind their eyes. They had promised themselves, and they had promised their children, that such a dark night would never fall again. And so, when the angry, shouting voices began to crackle through the static of the living room radios, a collective, silent decision was made across millions of homes. People simply turned the volume down. In a small, stone farmhouse surrounded by the rolling vineyards of France, a man named Elian wiped the sweat from his brow and looked out over his grapes. They were ripening perfectly, heavy and full of sweet promise. In the evenings, he would sit by the hearth with his wife, peeling apples, listening to the soft ticking of the mantel clock. When the newspaper arrived, carrying stark headlines of aggressive demands and loud speeches from the nation to the east, Elian would gently fold it in half, placing it out of sight beneath the bread box. He was a brave man, a man who had already given his youth to the mud of a terrible war. But he was exhausted. His soul longed for nothing more than the quiet turning of the seasons. This was the first, quiet victory of the approaching storm. The man who cast the shadow knew exactly how heavy the memory of the past weighed upon his neighbors. He did not need to break their walls, he only needed to lean against their deep, desperate desire for peace. He pushed, knowing that a tired man will take a step backward to avoid a fight. He shouted, knowing that a quiet room will shrink away from the noise. He weaponized the world's hope for peace, turning their own gentle nature into a quiet paralysis. Across the channel, in a brick-terraced house in London, a mother named Clara sat at her kitchen table late at night, the house wrapped in a comforting silence. The only light came from a small, yellow lamp, casting long, soft shadows against the floral wallpaper. She was writing a letter to her sister in the countryside. Her pen scratched softly against the thick paper. She wrote about the jam she had made that afternoon, about how the neighbor's cat had finally had kittens, about the little, beautiful mundane things that make up a life. She paused, looking toward the dark window. The news from the continent was troubling, a steady drumbeat of bluster and intimidation. The voices on the wireless spoke of borders and demands, of marching boots and closed fists. But Clara, like so many others, wrapped herself in the comforting blanket of denial. "It is only talk," she wrote. "It is only the loud boasting of a bully trying to look tall. They cannot possibly want to break the world again." This was the illusion that held the summer captive. The aggressive bluffing, the constant, rising tension, was a masterclass in psychological intimidation. It was a game of brinkmanship played against a continent that had already folded its hands. The aggressor succeeded so swiftly in these early days because he understood a dark truth: if you threaten the peace constantly, relentlessly, those who cherish peace will bend quite far just to keep the glass from shattering. They will give up a room to save the house. They will give up a field to save the farm. And so, the shadows crept forward, inch by silent inch, while the world held its breath and looked the other way. In the bustling cafes of Warsaw, the summer evenings were filled with the clinking of glasses and the soft murmur of string quartets. The city was alive, vibrant, and hopeful. Young couples walked arm in arm along the cobblestone streets, stopping to look at the reflections of street lamps in the slow-moving river. Among them was a young teacher named Tomasz. He carried a small, velvet box in his coat pocket, his heart fluttering with a quiet, joyful, nervous energy. He was planning a future, planning to ask the woman walking beside him to share a lifetime of quiet mornings and shared umbrellas. Yet, even here, at the edge of the East, the wind carried a chill. The intimidation was not just political, it was profoundly personal. It was the sudden silence that fell over a crowded room when a certain name was mentioned. It was the way people lowered their voices when discussing the news. Tomasz felt the weight of the shadow, the terrifying realization that the loud men across the border were demanding to take the very ground he walked upon. But what could a young man in love do against such a massive, monolithic threat? The human mind is remarkably resilient, but it is also remarkably adept at protecting itself from despair. Tomasz smiled at his companion, pushing the worry deep down into his chest. He chose to believe in the strength of alliances and the civilized nature of the modern world. He chose to believe that the storm clouds gathering on the horizon would simply rain themselves out before they reached his home. The success of the gathering storm was built upon these millions of small, quiet hopes. The aggressor fed on the hesitation of decent people. He mistook their weariness for weakness and their patience for surrender. He built a machine of pure, loud intimidation, designing it to look so terrifying, so overwhelmingly unified and angry, that the gentle hearts of the world would simply freeze in place. It was the terrifying power of an unanswered shout in a quiet library. As August slowly turned, the golden light of summer began to take on a deeper, heavier hue. The sunflowers in the fields bowed their heavy heads. The air grew still, losing the playful breezes of July. There was a sense of waiting, a breathless pause that stretched across the forests and the cities, the mountains and the plains. In their homes, people went through the comforting motions of their evening routines. They latched the wooden shutters. They drew the heavy curtains tight against the glass, as if thick fabric could keep out the changing tides of history. They tucked their children into soft beds, smoothing the blankets over small shoulders, whispering stories of brave knights and peaceful kingdoms. They turned off the lamps and lay in the dark, listening to the familiar, settling sounds of their houses. They lay there, staring at the ceiling, wrapped in the quiet dark. They whispered silent, desperate prayers into the night, hoping against all reason that the aggressive posturing was just a phantom of the twilight. They hoped the angry voices would tire themselves out. They hoped that when the morning sun broke over the horizon, it would melt away the shadows, and the world would simply go back to the quiet, gentle business of living. But outside, beyond the drawn curtains and the locked doors, the wind was changing direction. The leaves on the ancient oak trees rustled with a new, unfamiliar rhythm. The bluff had been called. The illusion of peace, woven from pure hope and deep exhaustion, was beginning to fray at the edges. And the continent, tired and longing for rest, fell asleep under a sky that was quietly, silently preparing to shatter. The morning dew still clung to the heavy summer leaves when the horizon began to hum with a sound the world had never heard. It was the first day of a new month, a day that was supposed to be wrapped in the gentle, golden haze of late summer. In towns and villages stretching across the rolling plains and ancient forests of Poland, the dawn arrived exactly as it always did. The light spilled softly over the eastern ridges, painting the clouds in shades of lavender and bruised peach. The world was waking up to its familiar, comforting rhythms. Roosters called out to the retreating night. Dogs stretched in the damp grass. In thousands of kitchens, wooden matches were struck against stone, catching with a brief, sulfur hiss before lighting the stoves that would boil the morning water. There is a profound, fragile beauty in the ordinary morning. It is a time of quiet promises, of fresh starts. In a small, cobblestone city, a baker named Merrick was already covered in a fine dusting of white flour. He had been awake since the stars were high and cold, his hands working the heavy, warm dough with a rhythm he had learned from his father, who had learned it from his father before him. The bakery smelled of yeast, melted butter, and the sweet, dark honey he folded into his special loaves. It was a smell that meant safety. It was a smell that meant home. He slid the long wooden paddle into the brick oven, watching the crusts begin to turn a perfect, golden brown. It was then that he felt it. It did not begin as a noise. It began as a vibration. A low, rhythmic tremor that traveled through the deep stone foundations of the city, up through the floorboards, and into the soles of Marek's worn leather boots. He paused, his hands resting on the edge of the flour bin. He thought, perhaps, it was a late summer thunderstorm rolling over the distant hills. He wiped his hands on his apron and stepped out the back door, into the cool morning air, looking up to find the dark clouds. But the sky was a clear, unbroken blue. And yet, the humming grew louder. It deepened into a vast, mechanical thrum that seemed to press against the chest. When the dark shapes finally swept low over the rooftops, moving with an impossible, terrifying speed, Marek simply stood there, a man of wheat and water, staring up at a sky entirely filled with iron. He did not understand the grand strategies of generals. He did not know the words for the coordinated, rushing storm that was about to be written into the history books. He only knew that the sky, the very roof of his world, had just been torn open. This was the terrible, profound shock of that morning. The sheer, unyielding speed of it all. History does not always turn slowly, like a great ship in the harbor. Sometimes, it folds over you in an instant, swallowing the light before you even know to close your eyes. The success of this new, sudden way of moving through the world was not just in its machinery. Its most devastating victory was over the human mind. It robbed people of the time they needed to understand. A few streets away from Marek's bakery, a young mother named Zofia was kneeling in the hallway of her apartment, tying a bright red ribbon into her daughter's hair. It was a day of monumental importance in their small universe, the first day of school. Zofia had spent the evening before carefully pressing her daughter's dark blue dress, making sure every pleat was sharp and perfect. Next to them on the wooden floor sat a leather satchel, smelling of fresh paper and newly sharpened graphite pencils. Zofia was smiling, whispering a small encouragement into her daughter's ear, when the first windows shattered. It was a sound like the breaking of a massive, crystal wave. The glass did not just fall, it was pushed inward by a wall of invisible pressure. The teacups on the dining table rattled and danced before vibrating right off the edge, smashing against the floorboards. Zofia did not scream. The mind, when faced with something so entirely outside the realm of the possible, often retreats into a strange, heavy quiet. She simply pulled her daughter by the shoulders, pressing the small girl into her chest, burying her face in the smell of the freshly washed blue dress. She held her there, sitting on the hallway floor amidst the glittering shards of glass, as the world outside transformed into a roaring engine. The speed of the change was paralyzing. Only moments ago, her greatest worry had been whether her daughter would make a friend in the classroom. Now, the very walls of the building seemed to be trembling in fear. The future had not just been altered, it had been entirely erased and replaced in the space of a single breath. This is what it felt like to be caught in the path of a machine that had practiced moving faster than human thought. To the strategists far away, it was a brilliant choreography of flying metal and rolling tracks, moving in perfect, lethal harmony. But to the families waking up beneath it, it was a sudden, inescapable force of nature. It was an earthquake that fell from the clouds. It was a flood that poured down the cobblestone streets. Out in the countryside, the shock was just as profound, rippling through the quiet farming villages where the rhythm of life had not changed in centuries. An older postman named Antony was riding his bicycle down a dirt road, his leather pouch heavy with letters. There were letters from sons working in the city, letters of unrequited love, letters carrying seeds for the autumn planting. He knew the names and faces of every family on his route. As he pedaled over a gentle rise, he stopped, placing his feet firmly on the dusty ground. In the distance, where the road met the horizon, a massive, swirling cloud of dust was rising into the sky. It was moving toward him with a velocity that defied reason. Horses could not run that fast. Tractors could not move with such furious intent. As the shapes within the dust became clear, dark, angular, and churning the earth into powder, Antony realized he was standing in the middle of a world that no longer existed. He did not turn and flee immediately. He simply stood beside his bicycle, his hand resting on the worn leather of his mail pouch. In a gesture of heartbreaking, quiet dignity, he unbuckled the flap, looked at the neat bundles of paper inside, and gently closed it again. He was a guardian of small, personal connections, caught in a moment where connection itself was being severed by the blade of history. He turned his bicycle around and began to walk back toward the village, pushing against the sudden, cold wind that smelled of diesel and turned earth. As the morning bled into afternoon, the sheer scale of the disruption settled over the land like a heavy blanket. The physical destruction was terrible, but the psychological dislocation was absolute. People wandered out of their homes, their faces pale and dusted with plaster, looking at their streets as if they had been transported to an alien landscape. Yet, even in the very center of this sudden, overwhelming storm, the quiet resilience of the human spirit began to flicker, like a small, stubborn candle in a dark room. Neighbors who had argued over property lines the day before now moved as one, their hands bleeding as they pulled debris away from doorways. Strangers shared small cups of water, their eyes meeting in a silent, profound understanding. In the basement of his bakery, Merrick the baker sat in the dim light with 3 families from the floors above. The oven upstairs was broken, the morning's bread turned to ash, but in his deep pockets, he had found a handful of the sweet, dark honey candies he kept for the neighborhood children. He passed them out in the dark, watching the small, sticky faces light up with a brief, sweet moment of normal comfort. They sat together, listening to the unfamiliar, heavy rumble of the new world passing directly over their heads. They did not speak of the future, because the future was a country they no longer recognized. They only spoke of the present moment. They held hands. They wrapped blankets around trembling shoulders. They offered soft, whispering voices to drown out the mechanical roar above. When the sun finally set on that first, endless day, it left behind a sky that felt bruised and weary. The stars emerged, one by one, cold and brilliant and entirely indifferent to the sudden sorrow of the earth below. Zofia sat by a shattered window, the cool night air blowing through the empty frame. Her daughter was finally asleep, exhausted by tears and terror, her head resting heavy on Zofia's lap. The red ribbon was gone, lost somewhere in the dust of the hallway. Zofia looked out at the silhouettes of the broken rooftops, listening to the distant, unnatural sounds that now filled the night. The world had shattered. The dawn they had woken up to belonged to another lifetime, a distant memory of peace that already felt like a dream. But as Zofia stroked her daughter's hair, feeling the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of the small chest beneath her hand, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. The sky had fallen, and the roads had been swallowed by iron, but they were still here. Breathing. Holding on to each other in the dark. And in a world that had just been overwhelmed by terrifying, merciless speed, the simple, quiet act of surviving the night was the only victory that mattered. The dust rising on the horizon was not made by the hooves of horses, but by a rushing, mechanical wind that simply swallowed the roads. For centuries, the roads that ribboned across the vast, gentle plains of Eastern Europe were pathways of a quiet, human rhythm. They were ancient tracks woven through dark pine forests and golden fields of rye, pounded flat by generations of wooden wagon wheels, the soft padding of migrating sheep, and the slow, steady footsteps of travelers carrying letters from one village to the next. The speed of life was measured by the stride of a walking man or the graceful, muscular gallop of a horse. If trouble came, it came at a pace that the mind could understand, moving just fast enough for a warning to be shouted across a valley, giving families time to gather their precious things and step out of the way. But in these early, fragile days of the changing world, the old roads were betrayed by a new, terrifying velocity. To understand the profound disorientation of those weeks, we must look at the faces of those who realized that history was suddenly moving faster than they could run. The success of the advancing storm was not just in its iron weight, but in its ability to completely unmoor people from their understanding of time and distance. In a quiet clearing just before the dawn, a young cavalryman named Jan stood beside his horse, a beautiful, dapple-gray mare he had raised from a foal. The air was cool and smelled sweetly of crushed fern and morning mist. With slow, practiced strokes, Jan ran a soft bristle brush over the horse's broad back. He felt the familiar, comforting warmth radiating from the animal, the gentle rise and fall of her breathing, the occasional flick of her ear as she listened to the waking birds. Jan wore a uniform that felt like a bridge to the past. It was tailored cloth, trimmed with the colors of his grandfather's regiment, holding the heavy, romantic weight of a bygone era. He had been raised on stories of glorious charges across sunlit meadows, of shining sabers catching the light, of honor decided by courage and the swiftness of a noble steed. He believed, as so many did, that warfare was still a test of the human heart against another human heart. He rested his forehead against the mare's warm neck, whispering soft words of encouragement, feeding her a small, bruised apple he had saved in his pocket. When the order came to mount, the squadron rode out through the trees, a moving painting of leather, polished brass, and quiet pride. They rode toward the rising sun, expecting to find an enemy they could look in the eye. Instead, they found the mechanical wind. When Jan and his squadron crested a long, grassy ridge, they pulled back on their reins, their horses dancing nervously beneath them. In the valley below, stretching as far as the eye could see, the road was entirely consumed by a river of dark, grinding metal. There were no marching men singing songs. There were only engines. Hundreds of them, roaring with a deafening, unnatural monotone, pushing forward with a relentless, terrifying momentum. The earth itself seemed to tremble, sending a low, sick vibration up through the legs of the horses. Jan sat perfectly still in his saddle. The wind whipped at his collar, carrying the bitter, chemical smell of burning diesel and exhausted oil. In that single, suspended moment, he did not feel the heat of battle. He felt a profound, heartbreaking sorrow. He realized, looking down at the endless column of steel, that his courage, his beautiful uniform, and his beloved, breathing horse were suddenly, entirely obsolete. The era he belonged to had vanished overnight. He did not order a charge. To draw a sword against a roaring engine was not bravery, it was a misunderstanding of the world. With a heavy, quiet grief, Jan stroked his mare's mane, gently turned her away from the ridge, and led his men back into the deep, silent woods. They were not defeated by a stronger army, they were simply outpaced by a new century. They vanished into the trees, ghosts of an older, gentler time, leaving the roads to the machines. While the cavalry retreated into the shadows, the roads themselves became rivers of a different kind of heartbreak. A few miles away, on a dusty country lane, a woman named Elzbieta was pulling a small, wooden handcart. Behind her walked her elderly father, leaning heavily on a carved walking stick, and beside her was her young son, clutching a small, stuffed bear. They were part of a vast, slow-moving tide of families, wrapped in woolen shawls, pushing bicycles piled high with woven baskets and tied with fraying rope. When the news of the approaching storm had reached their village, Elzbieta had packed only what she could carry. She had left behind the heavy oak table where her family had eaten their meals for 3 generations. She had left behind the delicate porcelain teacups lined up in the kitchen cupboard. On the cart, she carried only essentials, a heavy wool blanket to protect against the night chill, a small bag of oats, a tin pot, and a silver locket containing a photograph of her late husband. As she walked, the wooden wheels of the cart squeaked a slow, mournful rhythm. The road was choked with thousands of people moving at the exact same pace, the pace of a tired, blistered footstep. They walked with their heads down, surrounded by the soft murmurs of frightened children and the shuffling sound of leather shoes on gravel. There was a shared, quiet illusion among the walking crowds. They believed that if they simply kept walking, if they pushed their carts just a few more miles before the sun went down, they could stay ahead of the danger. They were moving away from the border, moving toward the safety of the interior, believing in the old geometry of conflict, where a front line was a slow-moving thing that gently pushed the innocent ahead of it. But the new rhythm of the world did not care for their weary footsteps. It happened in the late afternoon, when the shadows were beginning to stretch long and purple across the fields. The low hum that had been hovering at the edge of their hearing suddenly amplified into a roar. The ground shook, vibrating through the wooden handles of Elzbieta's cart. The crowd parted instinctively, pressing themselves into the muddy ditches and the tall, dry grass along the shoulders of the road. And then, the machines arrived. They did not stop. They did not slow down to acknowledge the frightened faces of the families lining the road. The columns of dark metal simply tore past them, kicking up a blinding, choking storm of pale dust. The noise was absolute, erasing all other sounds, drowning out the cries of the children and the soothing whispers of the mothers. Elzbieta held her son tightly against her chest, turning his face away from the swirling dust, coughing into the crook of her arm. She watched through squinted eyes as the massive, treaded vehicles rolled past, moving at a speed that felt entirely alien to the quiet farming lane. For an hour, the mechanical river flowed without interruption, a relentless display of coordinated speed that made the refugees feel incredibly small and hopelessly stationary. When the last of the vehicles finally disappeared over the horizon, leaving only a settling cloud of dust in its wake, a strange, heavy silence fell over the road. Elzbieta slowly stood up from the ditch, brushing the dry earth from her skirt. She looked down the road, in the direction the machines had gone. They had moved deeper into her country, moving faster in a single hour than she and her family could walk in a week. The profound disorientation washed over her like a cold wave. The enemy was no longer behind them. The enemy was ahead of them. The realization was paralyzing. They had been outrun. The front line had simply bypassed them, flowing around the slow-moving crowds like a swift river flowing around a heavy stone. They were stranded in the middle of a war that had overtaken them without a single shot being fired. The roads, which had always been the way to safety, the way to escape, no longer belonged to them. Yet, even in the depths of this surreal, terrifying helplessness, the quiet grace of humanity refused to be extinguished. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the dusty sky in bruised shades of violet and crimson, the families slowly emerged from the ditches. They did not scream. They did not collapse in despair. They simply looked at one another, their faces covered in the same pale dust, sharing a silent, profound understanding of their new reality. An older woman, sitting on an overturned bucket by the side of the road, caught the eye of Elzbieta's son. The boy was shivering slightly in the evening chill, his eyes wide and frightened. The older woman reached into the deep pocket of her apron and pulled out a single, dried apricot. It was small, wrinkled, and precious. With a gentle, trembling hand, she offered it to the boy. Elzbieta nodded her thanks, a small, weary smile touching the corners of her mouth. Her son took the fruit, sitting down on the edge of their wooden cart to eat it. Up and down the lane, in the twilight, small fires began to flicker to life. People gathered dry twigs and fallen branches, striking matches to push back the encroaching dark. They brought out tin cups and shared whatever water they had left. A man pulled a small, wooden flute from his coat and began to play a soft, slow melody, a lullaby that drifted on the cool evening air, rising above the lingering smell of diesel exhaust. They were outpaced by history. They were swallowed by a wind of iron and speed that had rendered their old ways of moving completely obsolete. But as they huddled together around the small, warm fires, wrapped in their wool blankets and their quiet resilience, they held on to the one thing the fast, cold machines could never overtake. They held on to each other. In the face of an overwhelming, mechanical storm, the simple, enduring warmth of the human heart continued to beat, slow, steady, and beautifully defiant in the dark. The snow fell softly, covering a world that had braced for the sky to fall, only to find itself trapped in a deafening, unnatural silence. It was a strange, haunting twilight of a season. After the terrible, rushing storm that had swallowed the east, the world had turned its fearful eyes to the west, waiting for the inevitable horizon to burn. Mothers had packed their children onto crowded, tear-filled trains, sending them away to the quiet countryside. Soldiers had kissed their wives goodbye on foggy station platforms, their hearts heavy with the expectation of a sudden, brutal end. The cities had plunged themselves into absolute darkness, drawing thick, heavy curtains across every window, waiting in the pitch black for the roar of engines from above. But the engines did not come. The sky remained stubbornly, beautifully clear, save for the gentle drifting of the winter snow. This was the season of the held breath. It was a time that history would later call a false war, a phony war, but for the millions of people living through those long, freezing months, there was nothing false about the terror that settled into their bones. To understand the subtle, devastating success of the enemy during this time, we must look away from the battlefields and into the quiet, dimly lit sitting rooms. We must look at the terrible, heavy weight of a raised fist that simply refuses to fall. When a threat is sudden and violent, the human spirit rises to meet it with a flurry of desperate action. But when a threat simply hovers, silent and invisible, it begins to act like a slow-acting poison on the mind. The illusion of inaction is a masterclass in psychological warfare. It does not break the walls of a fortress, it simply waits for the people inside to slowly, agonizingly, break themselves. Deep in the vast, subterranean fortresses that lined the borders of France, a young conscript named Julien sat on a narrow canvas cot, staring at the cold, curving concrete of the ceiling. He was buried deep beneath the earth, part of a massive, invincible shield of steel and stone designed to repel the greatest armies in the world. When he had first marched into the damp tunnels in the late autumn, he had been filled with a nervous, electric energy. He and his friends had stood at the observation slits, their fingers tight on the cold metal of their rifles, their eyes straining to catch the first glimpse of the advancing shadow. But the weeks bled into months, and the autumn leaves were buried beneath a heavy, silent blanket of white snow. Julien spent his days in a surreal, suffocating routine. He listened to the endless, rhythmic thrumming of the ventilation fans, a sound that seemed to press against his temples. He played countless hands of cards with men who had long ago run out of stories to tell. He drank bitter, lukewarm coffee from a tin cup, trying to chase away the deep, damp chill that seemed to radiate from the very walls of the bunker. And he waited. Sometimes, it was his turn to take the watch at the surface. He would climb the long, spiraling iron ladders, pushing open the heavy steel doors to breathe in the freezing, pine-scented air. He would look out across the narrow, icy river that separated his world from the enemy's. And there, through the drifting snow, he would see them. The enemy soldiers. They were not charging. They were not firing. They were simply hanging their wet laundry on makeshift lines strung between the bare winter trees. Sometimes, he could hear the faint, ghostly sound of a harmonica drifting across the water, playing a sad, slow melody that sounded terrifyingly like a song from his own childhood. It was maddening. Julien would return to the dark tunnels, his mind spinning with a profound, creeping dread. The waiting was rusting his spirit. He sat by the dim, yellow glow of a solitary bulb, a stub of a pencil in his hand, writing a letter to his young wife. "My dearest," he wrote, his handwriting slow and deliberate. "The snow is very deep today. We are safe, and we have enough soup to keep our bellies warm, but my heart is so very tired. We are like ghosts haunting a castle before we have even died. I catch myself wishing they would just come, just so the waiting would end. Please, kiss the baby for me. I close my eyes and try to remember the smell of your hair, but the damp concrete is all I can breathe." He folded the paper carefully, sealing it with a drop of wax, feeling as though he were sending a message from a tomb. This was the silent victory of the winter. By doing nothing, the enemy had transformed the great, invincible fortresses into prisons of the mind. They had turned the adrenaline of the defenders into a slow, paralyzing exhaustion. Across the channel, in the gentle, rolling hills of the English countryside, the winter settled over the sleepy villages like a heavy, woolen blanket. In a drafty stone farmhouse, an older woman named Beatrice stood by her kitchen window, watching the frost form delicate, fern-like patterns against the cold glass. Her home, usually so quiet and orderly, was now filled with the unfamiliar sounds of the city. She had taken in 2 young siblings, evacuated from the soot-stained streets of London just before the autumn winds arrived. When they had first stepped off the train, carrying their small, battered cardboard suitcases, their eyes had been wide with the terrified expectation of immediate destruction. They had clutched their little square boxes, the ones containing their government-issued gas masks, as if they were holy relics. But the bombs had not fallen. The sirens had not wailed. The great, anticipated end of the world had simply failed to arrive. Instead, there was only the slow, dragging quiet of January. Beatrice watched the 2 children playing in the snowy yard, throwing small, powdery snowballs at a wooden fence post. They laughed, their breath pluming in the freezing air, looking like any ordinary children on any ordinary winter afternoon. But Beatrice knew the truth. She saw how they flinched when the back door slammed shut. She saw how the little boy carefully placed his gas mask box at the very edge of his bed every single night, never letting it out of his sight. The extraordinary had become normalized, and that, in itself, was a quiet tragedy. Every evening, as the sun dipped below the skeletal branches of the elm trees, a new kind of ritual took place. Beatrice would move from room to room, pulling the heavy, black fabrics across the windows, making absolutely certain that not a single sliver of warm, golden light escaped into the night. It was a suffocating feeling, wrapping the house in a shroud of total darkness. She would sit by the hearth, the fire crackling softly, knitting thick wool socks for soldiers she would never meet. The rhythmic clicking of her needles was the only sound in the room, save for the slow, heavy ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Tick, tick, tick. Each second felt heavy, laden with an unspoken question. When? This was the creeping dread that paralyzed the nations. The illusion of inaction bred a desperate, fragile hope, and that hope was a dangerous thing. People began to whisper in the grocery lines and the village pubs. Perhaps the enemy had changed their mind. Perhaps the great machine had stalled in the snow. Perhaps, if they all just stayed very quiet and very still, the nightmare would simply pass them by. It was a beautiful, tragic delusion. The human mind simply cannot sustain a state of pure panic for months on end. It must find a way to rest, to build a new normal, even if that normal is built on the edge of a precipice. The enemy understood this perfectly. They understood that if you give a tired, frightened world a moment of absolute silence, they will fill that silence with their own doubts, their own lethargy, and their own desperate desire for peace. The troops on the borders grew sluggish and bored. The families in the countryside grew complacent, quietly resenting the strict rules of the blackout and the rationing of sugar and tea, wondering why they were sacrificing so much for a war that seemed to exist only on paper. The political leaders argued in endless, circular meetings, mistaking the enemy's pause for weakness, completely failing to see the coiled spring growing tighter and tighter in the dark. And so, the winter dragged on. The ice thickened on the lakes. The wood smoke drifted lazily from millions of chimneys, rising into a sky that was painfully, deceptively clear. In her quiet farmhouse, Beatrice finished tying off the yarn on a newly knitted sock. She smoothed the rough wool with her worn hands, setting it gently into a growing pile in a woven basket. She walked to the window and carefully pulled back a tiny corner of the blackout curtain, just enough to look out into the freezing night. The yard was bathed in the pale, silver light of a full moon. The snow glowed with a quiet, ethereal beauty. It looked so peaceful. It looked like a world entirely asleep. But she pressed her hand against the cold glass, feeling the profound, heavy ache in her chest. She knew, deep down in the quietest corners of her soul, that this was not the peace of a resting world. It was the peace of a forest just before the lightning strikes. It was the absolute, terrifying stillness of the tide pulling far, far back from the shore, gathering its terrible strength in the deep ocean, preparing to return with a force that would wash away the world. The season of the held breath was coming to an end. The lungs of the continent were burning, desperate for air, desperate for resolution, even if that resolution meant the breaking of the sky. As the first, subtle signs of the spring thaw began to soften the frozen earth, as the ice began to crack on the rivers with sounds like distant rifle fire, the people of the waiting nations closed their eyes. They had survived the long, silent winter. But as the shadows began to shift, and the mechanical hum returned to the distant horizon, they realized the most terrifying truth of all. The quiet had never been a sanctuary. It had only ever been a trap. The silence of a frozen forest is not empty, it holds its breath just before the snow falls from a heavy branch. Far in the north, where the world is drawn in stark lines of silver, charcoal, and blinding white, the winter arrived with a quiet, ancient heavy grace. It was a season of profound stillness, where the lakes turned to solid glass and the breath of a wandering deer plumed like smoke in the moonlight. For the people who lived among these endless, dark pine forests, the deep snow was not an enemy. It was a familiar companion, a quiet blanket that tucked the earth in for a long, necessary slumber. But as the days grew short and the sun barely crested the horizon, a new, heavy shadow crept into the pristine white woods. A giant from the east, a vast and seemingly endless force, began to push its way into the quiet sanctuary of the trees. To understand the tragedy of this bitter winter, and the dangerous illusion it cast across the watching world, we must look closely at the footprints left behind in the deep snow. In a small, snow-draped cabin hidden among a thick grove of birch trees, a young farmer named Elias sat close to a small iron stove. The fire crackled gently, casting a warm, dancing orange glow across the wooden floorboards. Beside him, his wife was quietly tearing a fine, white linen bedsheet into long, even strips. There was no anger in her delicate movements, only a deep, heartbreaking resignation. She draped the white cloth over Elias's heavy winter coat, stitching it in place with careful, steady hands. Elias was not a soldier forged in a loud, mechanical academy. He was a man who knew how to listen to the ice. He knew how to read the tracks of the Arctic fox, and he knew that a dry branch snapped underfoot sounded like a gunshot in the freezing air. When he stepped out into the night, wrapped entirely in white, he did not march. He simply stepped onto his long, hand-carved wooden skis, and slipped into the forest. He became a ghost, a whisper of snow drifting among the pines. There were thousands like Elias. Bakers, teachers, and woodcutters, trading the gentle warmth of their hearths for the biting, glittering cold of the wilderness. They moved in small, silent groups. When they rested, they huddled in snow pits beneath the heavy boughs of ancient evergreens, passing a small metal thermos of hot lingonberry juice between them. The sweet, warm liquid was a momentary taste of home, a tiny spark of light against the overwhelming dark. They did not speak of grand victories. They spoke softly of their children, of the books they had left open on their nightstands, of the simple, desperate hope that the spring would eventually come. They fought a quiet, defensive struggle, using the very nature of their homeland as their shield. They were small, and they were few, but they were bound by an unbreakable, quiet love for the earth beneath their skis. A few miles away, caught on a narrow, icy logging road, the invading giant was stumbling. The great machine that had marched into the forest was designed for open plains and clear skies. It was heavy, dark, and entirely unsuited for the delicate, treacherous geometry of the winter woods. Long columns of dark metal vehicles sat frozen, their engines refusing to turn over in a cold that felt absolute and unforgiving. Huddled against the icy flank of a stalled truck was a young conscript named Pavel. He had been brought from a warm, sunlit village far to the south, a place where the air smelled of sweet grass and the winters were gentle. He wore a coat that was too thin, and boots that offered no protection against the biting frost. He rubbed his numb, gloveless hands together, his breath catching in his throat. Pavel did not want to conquer this quiet, freezing land. He did not understand the angry voices of the men who had drawn lines on the maps far away in the grand capital. He was simply a boy, terribly lost and profoundly cold. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. It was a letter to his mother, written in the faint light of a lantern days ago. He had written about the strange, beautiful green lights that danced across the night sky, the aurora that looked like spirits weaving through the stars. He had written about how the snow was so deep it swallowed the sounds of the world. He did not write about his fear, or the unseen ghosts in white who slipped through the trees, striking swiftly and vanishing back into the blizzard. He only wrote that he missed the smell of her baking bread, and that he hoped the dog was keeping her feet warm by the fire. Pavel pressed the letter back over his heart, closing his eyes. The tragedy of the woods was not just a clash of nations, it was the heartbreaking reality of ordinary boys like Pavel, forced into a brutal, freezing wilderness by the sheer momentum of a clumsy, uncaring machine. They were victims of the deep snow, trapped in a dark uniform against a landscape of blinding white, shivering in the shadow of the tall pines. And as the cold deepened, the world watched. Far away from the frozen lakes, in the warm, brightly lit drawing rooms and grand offices of Central Europe, men stood by crackling fireplaces, listening to the reports humming through the telegraph wires. They traced their fingers over large, colorful maps, marking the slow, agonizing progress of the giant in the snow. These observers, the architects of the new mechanical storm that had shattered the autumn, watched the clumsy struggle in the north with a growing, quiet smile. They sat in velvet chairs, sipping warm tea from delicate porcelain cups, and they began to tell themselves a story. They looked at the mighty army of the East, stalled on the icy roads, struggling against farmers on wooden skis, and they drew a fatal, arrogant conclusion. They did not see the profound, unnatural harshness of the winter. They did not see the sheer, quiet brilliance of the men defending their homes. They only saw a giant stumbling, its metal beasts frozen, its dark columns broken. This was the subtle, invisible success that was born in the deep snow. It was not a victory of land, but a catastrophic victory of perception. The watchers in the warm rooms looked at their own pristine uniforms, at their own roaring engines and their perfect, coordinated speed. They remembered how quickly they had swallowed the roads and folded the horizons just months before. A deep, intoxicating hubris began to take root in their hearts. They convinced themselves that they were an entirely different breed of conqueror. They believed that their machine would never stall, that their boots would never freeze, that the world would simply part before them like water. They mistook the tragic suffering of boys like Pavel for the inherent weakness of an entire empire. They looked at the struggling giant and decided, in the quiet comfort of their heated rooms, that when the time came, they could simply kick the giant's door in, and the whole rotten structure would come crashing down. It is a terrifying thing when a conqueror begins to believe his own myth. The illusion of absolute invincibility is a heavy, dangerous crown. It blinds the wearer to the simple, enduring truths of the earth. It makes them forget that winter is a force older than any engine, and that the quiet resilience of the human spirit cannot be measured on a map. The brave, silent struggle in the northern forests gifted the watching enemy a false sense of supreme confidence. It fed their pride. It encouraged their grand, reckless ambitions, convincing them that they were an unstoppable force of nature, entirely immune to the humble stumbling blocks of weather and weariness. As the long, dark weeks finally began to soften, the biting edge of the wind lost its cruelest sting. The deep snow slowly, gently began to pack down, turning heavy and wet under the returning sun. The quiet, heartbreaking war in the woods drew to a close. The small, brave nation was forced to bend to the sheer, overwhelming weight of the giant. Elias folded his white suit, placing it carefully in the bottom of a wooden chest. He looked out his window at the birch trees, his heart heavy with a profound, quiet sorrow, but his spirit remained entirely his own. He returned to his fields, waiting for the earth to thaw, carrying the memory of the frozen nights and the hot lingonberry juice forever in his soul. And in the warm, opulent rooms far to the south, the dangerous illusion hardened into absolute certainty. The world turned its fearful gaze back toward the west, waiting for the spring. They did not know that the true disaster of the winter was not found in the borders that were moved, but in the minds of the men who watched from afar. The deep snow had hidden the truth. It had buried the reality of human frailty beneath a blanket of white, leaving behind only footprints that led straight into the heart of a terrible, unyielding pride. The spring would soon arrive, bringing with it a storm unlike any the world had ever seen. And the storm would ride on the wings of a deadly, quiet arrogance, born in the silence of a frozen forest, where a struggling giant had accidentally convinced the devil that he was a god. The sea was a mirror of pale silver, holding its breath just before the dawn, when the mist gave birth to mountains of iron. In the high, quiet north, the ocean had always been a friend, a provider, and a grand, insurmountable wall. Along the jagged, breathtaking fjords of Norway, and the gentle, wind-swept coastlines of Denmark, the rhythm of life was dictated by the tides. It was a world that smelled of salt, pine needles, and tarred rope. The people here lived in a peaceful, deliberate isolation, trusting in the vast, freezing waters to keep the madness of the southern continent at bay. They believed, as generations had before them, that their shores were too distant, too wild, and too deeply hidden in the mist to be swallowed by the marching storm. But the storm had learned to swim. To understand the terrible, silent success of this new kind of conquest, we must look not at the battlefields, but at the harbors just as the sun began to rise. We must understand the paralyzing, dreamlike power of sheer audacity. It was a morning that felt entirely ordinary. In the flat, beautiful city of Copenhagen, the cobblestones were damp with the overnight dew. An older man named Lars, a baker whose hands were perpetually dusted with flour, was walking toward his shop near the docks. He had a wool scarf wrapped tightly around his neck against the early spring chill. The city was just beginning to stir. The only sounds were the distant cries of seagulls and the soft, rhythmic clicking of a few early bicycles rolling over the wet stones. Lars paused at the edge of the harbor to light his pipe, cupping his hands around the small, warm flame. When he looked up, through the swirling gray fog that clung to the water, he saw them. They were not merchant ships bringing coal or timber. They were massive, dark silhouettes, painted in the flat, lifeless gray of war. But there was no thunder of cannons. There was no screaming, no frantic ringing of church bells. The ships were simply gliding into the berths, moving with a calm, terrifying precision, as if they had always belonged there. Lars stood perfectly still, the match burning down to his fingertips. He watched, trapped in a profound, uncomprehending paralysis, as foreign soldiers in heavy coats began to walk down the gangplanks. They did not charge with bayonets fixed, they simply strolled onto the pier, forming quiet, orderly lines on the cobblestones. By the time the city truly woke, the occupation was already complete. This was the weaponization of the unthinkable. The mind is a fragile instrument, built to understand the world through patterns and logic. When confronted with something so brazenly impossible, an invading army sailing casually into a peaceful capital before breakfast, the human mind simply stutters. It refuses to believe what the eyes are seeing. The success of this morning lay in that quiet hesitation. By the time the defenders realized they were at war, the enemy was already standing in their town squares, asking for directions. Further north, in the deep, ancient fjords of Norway, the mist was even thicker, clinging to the towering cliffs like a heavy woolen veil. The water here was dark, cold, and immensely deep. A fisherman named Henrik was already miles out from his village, sitting alone in a small, wooden boat that smelled of age and ocean brine. He was a quiet man, a man who knew the shifting moods of the water better than he knew his own reflection. He sat with his hands wrapped around a battered tin thermos, sipping hot, bitter coffee, waiting for the first light to illuminate his nets. The silence of the fjord was profound, a sacred, echoing quiet that belonged only to the mountains and the sea. Then, Henrik felt the water begin to shift. It was not a wave born of the wind. It was a deep, unnatural displacement, a swelling of the sea from below. The water lapped frantically against the sides of his small wooden hull. He peered into the dense fog, his eyes narrowing. A shadow was moving through the mist. It was a shadow so large that it seemed to blot out the rising sun, a towering cathedral of steel sliding silently through the narrow, treacherous channel. Henrik could hear the low, throaty hum of its massive engines, a sound that vibrated right through the wooden planks of his boat and into his chest. He held his breath. The warship was so close he could see the condensation dripping from its cold metal hull. He could see the dark barrels of its guns, pointing blindly into the fog. The sheer scale of it made Henrik feel as small as a floating leaf. They were sailing right past the ancient coastal fortresses, right under the noses of the sleeping sentries, trusting the fog and their own breathtaking nerve to shield them. It was an act of such supreme arrogance, such reckless confidence, that it bypassed every defense the mind could raise. How do you sound an alarm against a ghost? How do you fight an enemy that simply slips through your front door while you are sleeping? Henrik did not reach for the flares in his tackle box. Like Lars on the docks of Copenhagen, he was frozen by the sheer, surreal impossibility of the moment. He simply sat in his small wooden boat, watching the dark Leviathan slide past him, heading toward the heart of his country. He felt a deep, profound sorrow wash over him, cold and heavy as the ocean itself. The sea had not protected them. The sea had simply brought the iron to their doorstep. As the morning burned away the fog, the surreal reality of the day settled over the northern nations. It was a gentle, quiet heartbreak. There were no great, sweeping battles to mark the end of their freedom. There was only the sudden, jarring realization that the world had shifted beneath their feet. In a small apartment overlooking a town square, a young woman named Freya sat at a wooden desk, her hands trembling slightly as she wrote a letter to her brother, who was studying far away in a different country. The ink flowed slowly onto the pale paper. "My dearest," she wrote, her handwriting small and delicate. "I do not know how to explain this to you, for I barely understand it myself. I went to sleep in a free country, and I woke up to find strange flags hanging from the telegraph poles. They are just standing there, on the corners, drinking coffee and looking at maps. It feels as though we are in a play, and someone has changed the scenery while we were resting in the wings. We are not bleeding, but we are broken. The town is so quiet today. No one knows whether to open their shops or lock their doors. We are paralyzed by the morning." She folded the letter, sealing it with a heavy heart, knowing she had no idea when, or if, the mail would ever leave the port again. This was the quiet, tragic masterpiece of the early storm. It did not just conquer land, it conquered the very concept of safety. It taught the world that there were no walls high enough, no oceans wide enough, to keep the new, mechanical rhythm at bay. If you could not see them coming, you could not fight them. Yet, even in the center of this bewildering, bloodless defeat, the roots of the northern trees remained stubbornly, deeply anchored in the earth. The initial shock, the terrible, paralyzing awe, slowly began to give way to something else. As the sun moved across the sky, casting long shadows from the foreign ships now anchored in the beloved harbors, the ordinary people began to find each other's eyes. Lars, the baker, returned to his shop. He did not speak to the soldiers in the street, but he baked his bread, handing a warm, fragrant loaf to his neighbor with a slow, deliberate nod. Henrik, the fisherman, rowed his small boat back to the village. He tied it to the wooden dock with tight, angry knots, his face set like carved stone. They had been surprised. They had been outmaneuvered by an enemy that did not respect the old rules of the world. But as the evening approached, and the northern chill returned to the air, a quiet, invisible resilience began to kindle in the dark. It was the resilience of people who know how to survive long, freezing winters. They understood that the tide had brought the iron, and the iron was heavy. It would sit upon their chests and try to squeeze the hope from their lungs. But the iron could not melt the snow. It could not change the direction of the wind. And it could not reach the quiet, fiercely guarded places in the human heart where true freedom is kept warm. That night, behind heavy curtains and locked doors, families sat around their wooden tables. They did not raise their voices. They simply poured their tea, looked at the faces of their children, and made a silent, collective vow. The morning had belonged to the ships in the mist. The day had belonged to the shock of the new. But the long, dark night ahead would belong to them. They would be the quiet resistance, the slow, grinding ice that eventually cracks the stone. The iron had arrived, but the sea remained. And the sea, as every fisherman knows, always reclaims what is hers in the end. The tulips were heavy with the sweet, wet dew of spring when the sky and the earth suddenly began to move as one. To live in the low, flat lands of the continent is to live with a profound, unbroken relationship with the horizon. In the gentle countryside, where the green fields stretch out like a vast, emerald carpet toward the edge of the world, there are no mountains to hide behind, no deep valleys to obscure the view. You can watch the weather arriving from miles away. You can see the slow, gathering bruise of a rain cloud long before the first drop falls. The people here built their lives around this wide, open predictability. They built windmills that turned with the slow, steady breath of the ocean, and they dug winding, peaceful canals that reflected the vast blue sky. They trusted the land, and they trusted the sky, believing that danger, if it ever came, would arrive slowly, walking across the plains where everyone could see it. But the new storm did not walk. It flew, it rolled, and it shattered the very concept of distance. The terrifying success of this advancing force was born from a dark, mechanical harmony. It was a perfectly synchronized dance of iron and shadow, a coordination so complete and so overwhelming that it made the human mind simply stop and stare. To the villagers waking up in their quiet brick houses, the invasion did not feel like a battle. It felt like a sudden, inescapable folding of the world. In a small, sunlit field just outside a sleepy village, an older farmer named Peter knelt in the rich, dark soil. His hands were withered, carrying the deep, permanent stains of a lifetime spent coaxing life from the earth. He was planting cabbages, moving down the long rows with a quiet, rhythmic grace. It was a beautiful morning. The air smelled of damp earth and blooming hawthorn. Then, Peter felt a strange, new sensation. It began not in his ears, but in the wooden soles of his clogs. The ground beneath him, the solid, dependable earth he had known since he was a boy, began to tremble. It was a low, steady vibration, like the heartbeat of a massive, unseen beast. He stood up slowly, wiping the soil from his trousers, and looked toward the east. A thick, gray wall of dust was rising into the air, rolling toward him with an unnatural speed. Before his mind could make sense of the trembling earth, a sudden, deafening roar tore through the quiet morning. Peter looked up. The vast, open sky, the pride of the flatlands, was suddenly filled with dark, angular shapes. They moved so fast they seemed to tear the very fabric of the air, casting swift, terrifying shadows that flickered rapidly across Peter's face. This was the terrifying genius of the coordinated storm. It arrived from everywhere all at once. The ground shook with the weight of armor, while the sky screamed with the fury of engines. There was no front line. There was no safe distance. The danger was above, below, and straight ahead, moving with a unified purpose that made any thought of resistance feel utterly, heartbreakingly futile. Peter stood in his field, a solitary man with a small iron trowel, caught between a falling sky and a trembling earth. He did not run. Where could a man run when the entire horizon is closing in? He simply lowered his arms, letting the trowel slip from his fingers into the soft dirt. A profound, heavy sorrow settled over his shoulders. He felt the overwhelming insignificance of flesh and bone when faced with a machine that moved with such merciless, coordinated perfection. He turned and began to walk slowly back to his farmhouse, intent only on holding his wife's hand as the shadow washed over their home. The sheer scale of the coordination bypassed the old defenses of the world. For generations, the nations of the low plains had trusted in their water. They believed that if danger threatened, they could open the ancient dikes, flood the fields, and turn their country into an island fortress. It was a strategy of slow, deliberate defense, built for a world that moved at the speed of a marching boot. But how do you flood the sky? In a bright, airy classroom in a small brick schoolhouse, a young teacher named Marguerite was wiping a chalkboard clean. Her students, a collection of small, quiet children with worn sweaters and scuffed shoes, were bent over their wooden desks, carefully practicing their penmanship. The room was filled with the soft, soothing sound of chalk on slate and the gentle rustle of paper. When the low, throaty drone of the planes began to rattle the tall glass windows, Marguerite did not panic. She had promised herself that she would be the calm harbor for these children, no matter what the wind brought. She walked slowly to the window and looked up into the clouds. What she saw was not a rain of bombs, but a strange, surreal snowfall. Hundreds of white canopies were blooming in the gray sky, drifting down silently over the canals, the tulip fields, and the old stone bridges. The enemy was simply dropping from the clouds, completely ignoring the flooded fields and the guarded roads. They were falling like dandelion seeds behind the locked doors of the nation. Marguerite watched a paratrooper drift past her window, so close she could see the youthful, terrified tension in his face as he grasped his harness. The impossible had become real. The fortress had been bypassed from above. She turned away from the window, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but her face remained a mask of soft, gentle calm. She walked to the center of the room and clapped her hands softly. "Children," she whispered, her voice steady and warm. "Bring your chairs into the center of the room, away from the glass. We are going to read a story." As the heavy boots of the falling soldiers finally hit the cobblestones outside, and the shouts of a new, terrifying reality began to echo through the village square, Marguerite sat on a small wooden stool, surrounded by her students. She opened a worn book of fairy tales and began to read. She read of talking animals and brave princesses, raising her voice just enough to drown out the mechanical rumble that was shaking the walls. She built a tiny, invisible fortress of words and warmth right there in the middle of the collapsing world. It was a quiet, magnificent act of everyday heroism. She could not stop the horizon from folding, but she could protect the fragile, beautiful imaginations of the children in her care. The emotional weight of an unstoppable machine is a heavy, suffocating thing. It drains the color from the world. When you are faced with a force that moves with such absolute, overwhelming coordination, the mind instinctively seeks shelter. In a damp, shallow ditch beside a country road, a young border guard named Johann sat with his knees pulled tightly to his chest. His uniform was covered in mud, and his rifle lay forgotten in the wet grass beside him. He had been stationed there to watch a bridge, to defend a line on a map. But the bridge had been taken from the sky before he had even finished his morning tea, and the tanks had simply rolled over it as if he were entirely invisible. He was writing a letter to his mother on a small, torn piece of ledger paper, resting it against the leather of his ammunition pouch. His hands were shaking so terribly he could barely form the letters. "Dearest mother," he wrote, the pencil leaving faint, trembling marks. "I am safe, but I do not know how to explain what has happened. We were prepared to fight men, but we were met with a roaring dragon. The sky and the earth were working together against us. The map means nothing anymore. The lines are gone. I aimed my rifle at a machine the size of a house, and I felt like a child trying to sweep back the sea with a broom. Please do not worry for me. A woman in the farmhouse behind us brought me a cup of warm milk and a slice of bread this morning, even while the planes were flying over. There is still kindness here. But the country is gone." Johann folded the note and tucked it into his breast pocket, resting his hand over it. He closed his eyes and listened to the vast, mechanical rhythm that now owned the roads and the skies. He felt no shame in his fear, only a profound, quiet acceptance. The old world of lines and trenches was over. This was the true victory of the early storm. It was a victory of the mind. By coordinating their iron so perfectly, by moving faster and arriving from more directions than the human brain could process, the invaders made surrender feel like the only logical choice. They folded the wide, open horizons of the low plains into a small, dark box. Yet, within that darkness, the quiet, stubborn light of humanity refused to go out completely. The nations fell in a matter of days. The grand, sweeping skies were claimed by foreign wings, and the flat, green earth was scarred by heavy tracks. But as the dusk settled over the newly conquered lands, painting the canals in shades of deep violet and gray, the ordinary people retreated into the quiet sanctuary of their homes. Peter sat at his kitchen table, holding his wife's hand across the worn wood, listening to the unfamiliar voices echoing in the street outside. Marguerite kissed the foreheads of her students as their worried parents rushed to collect them, offering a soft, reassuring smile that hid her own trembling heart. Johann drank his warm milk in the ditch, finding a tiny moment of grace in the middle of the terror. They were overwhelmed. They were outmatched by a terrifying new rhythm that had shaken their world to its foundations. But as they closed their shutters, lit their small lanterns, and waited in the quiet dark, they kept the fragile embers of their gentle world warm. The horizon had folded, and the sky had fallen, but they were still breathing. And in the face of an unstoppable machine, simply holding on to your own humanity is the quietest, most beautiful rebellion of all. The roots of the ancient trees were so deep they seemed to hold the very center of the earth together, dreaming a long, green dream that no man could ever disturb. There are places in the world that feel too old for the hurried, frantic concerns of the present day. The deep, rolling hills of the Ardennes were exactly such a place. It was a forest of fairy tales and whispered legends, a vast, tangled ocean of dark pine, silver birch, and ancient oak. The canopy was so thick that the sunlight only reached the forest floor in thin, golden shafts, illuminating dancing dust motes and soft carpets of emerald moss. The air here was heavy, fragrant with the scent of damp earth, crushed fern, and the sweet, resinous breath of the evergreens. For the generals sitting in their bright, airy offices far away in the capital, this ancient forest was not just a beautiful wilderness, it was a fortress. It was a comforting line drawn on their large, paper maps, marked with a single, reassuring word, impassable. They looked at the steep ravines, the winding, muddy trails, and the tightly woven trunks of the ancient trees, and they believed that nature herself had built a wall that no modern machine could ever breach. And so, they left the forest to the quiet ones. They sent their youngest, most inexperienced conscripts, and their oldest, most tired reservists, to guard a place that they believed needed no guarding at all. In a small, misty clearing just as the dawn was beginning to paint the sky in bruised shades of violet, a young soldier named Luke was sitting on a fallen log. He was barely out of school, a boy with soft hands and a heart that longed for the bright, open coastline of his home in the south. The deep, shadowed woods made him feel small, but they also made him feel incredibly safe. He was holding a tin cup of coffee, letting the rising steam warm his chilled cheeks. Across his lap rested a pad of paper, covered in his neat, careful handwriting. "Dearest Mother," he wrote, the tip of his pencil pausing as a small, brightly colored bird flitted across the clearing. "It is so incredibly quiet here. The sergeants tell us that the great storm is raging far to the north, but in these woods, the loudest sound is the wind moving through the pine needles. We spend our days watching the shadows lengthen and listening to the river over the stones. Sometimes, I forget why I am wearing this heavy wool uniform. I feel more like a park ranger than a soldier. Do not worry for me. The trees are standing guard. We are hidden in the palm of the forest's hand." He folded the letter, a soft smile touching the corners of his mouth. It was a beautiful, tragic illusion. The forest was entirely at peace, completely unaware that it was about to be asked to hold back the ocean. To understand the devastating success of this moment, we must understand the danger of a blind spot. A blind spot is not a physical weakness, it is a failure of the imagination. When you believe something is impossible, you stop looking for it. You turn your eyes away, resting your heavy head on the comforting pillow of your own assumptions. The enemy did not just find a gap in the physical line, they found a gap in the mind of the world. They looked at the impassable forest and saw only a shadowed doorway that had been left completely unlocked. A few yards away from Luke, an older man named Marcel was carefully feeding dry twigs into a small, smoking campfire. Marcel was a man of the woods, a quiet carpenter who knew the name of every tree and the meaning of every change in the wind. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, respecting the silence of the morning. But as Marcel reached for another branch, his hand froze in midair. He tilted his head, closing his eyes. He did not hear anything, not at first. He felt it. A low, rhythmic tremor was moving through the damp earth, traveling up through the roots of the oak tree behind him, humming faintly in the soles of his worn leather boots. It was a vibration that did not belong to the natural world. It was too steady, too heavy, too relentless. Marcel slowly lowered the twig. He looked at the young boys sitting around the clearing, sipping their coffee, writing their letters, completely unaware of the approaching tide. A cold, profound dread began to pool in the pit of Marcel's stomach. He stood up, walking slowly to the edge of the trees, and placed his palm flat against the rough bark of an ancient pine. The tree was trembling. Then, the birds stopped singing. The sudden, absolute silence of the wildlife was louder than a siren. The woodland creatures, with their old, instinctual wisdom, were fleeing. And then came the sound. It was not a sudden explosion. It was a slow, creeping growl, a mechanical churning that seemed to rise from the very belly of the earth. It was the sound of heavy diesel engines, hundreds of them, groaning and straining as they pushed their way through the tangled underbrush. It was the sound of iron treads crushing centuries-old moss into mud. Luke looked up from his letter, the gentle smile fading from his lips. He stood, dropping his pencil into the damp leaves. He looked toward the deep shadows of the tree line, trying to understand what his ears were telling him. The impossible was happening. The impenetrable wall of nature was being torn down, branch by branch. When the first metal beast broke through the edge of the clearing, it felt entirely surreal. It did not look like a machine of war, it looked like an alien leviathan rising from the depths of the ocean. It was painted in dark, mottled colors, smeared with mud and draped in broken branches, a nightmare of steel and grinding gears violently pushing its way into a fairy tale. As it moved forward, a massive, ancient oak tree, a tree that had stood through storms and seasons for hundreds of years, groaned in protest before snapping with a sound like a cannon shot, falling heavily to the forest floor. The success of this breakthrough was not in the firing of weapons. The success was in the sheer, overwhelming shock of the presence itself. The young boys in the clearing did not raise their rifles. How could they? They had been told this would never happen. They had been promised that the forest was their shield. They stood paralyzed, holding their tin cups of coffee, watching as the ancient, silent woods suddenly filled with roaring engines and coughing black smoke. The horizon, which they believed was safely miles away, had just walked right into their morning campfire. The illusion of the fortress had shattered, leaving them profoundly, heartbreakingly exposed. Marcel, the old carpenter, did not panic. He understood, with the quiet, weary wisdom of a man who knows he cannot stop a landslide, that the battle for the forest was lost before it had ever begun. He walked over to Luke, who was staring at the approaching tanks with wide, unblinking eyes. Marcel gently placed a heavy, calloused hand on the young boy's shoulder. "Pick up your bag, my boy," Marcel whispered, his voice a calm, steady anchor in the middle of the rising mechanical storm. "The woods no longer belong to us. We must walk." This was the quiet heroism of that terrible morning. It was not a glorious, doomed charge against an impossible foe. It was the simple, heartbreaking act of an older man guiding a terrified boy away from the edge of the abyss. Marcel gathered the young conscripts, moving them gently but firmly, leading them away from the clearing and deeper into the retreating shadows. They left behind their tents, their warm coffee, and the comforting letters they had been writing to their mothers. They became ghosts in their own forest, slipping quietly through the trees, staying just ahead of the grinding tracks and the falling timber. As they walked, the air grew thick with the smell of exhaust and pulverized wood. The sacred, ancient silence of the Ardennes was entirely broken, replaced by the relentless, unnatural rhythm of the invading machine. The enemy was pouring through the blind spot, moving with a speed and a confidence that defied all the old logic of the world. They were succeeding because they had dared to imagine the impossible, and in doing so, they had turned the greatest natural fortress in Europe into a highway. But in the hearts of the men walking away, there was a quiet, enduring grace. Luke walked closely behind Marcel, focusing on the rhythmic sway of the older man's broad shoulders. He was terrified, his heart beating like a trapped bird against his ribs, but he felt a profound gratitude for the gentle hand that had pulled him from the trance. When night finally fell, they found shelter in a small, damp cave hidden beneath a rocky overhang. They sat in the pitch black, listening to the endless rumble of the engines moving through the valleys below. It was a sound that would haunt their dreams forever. Luke reached into his pocket and felt the folded edges of his unfinished letter. The words he had written that morning felt like they belonged to another lifetime, to a different, innocent boy who had believed the trees could keep him safe. He closed his eyes and leaned his head against the cold stone wall of the cave. "Are we lost, Marcel?" Luke whispered into the dark, his voice barely louder than a breath. Marcel shifted in the darkness, pulling his wool coat tighter against the evening chill. "We are displaced, little one," the older man replied softly. "The world we knew this morning has been swallowed. The lines on the map have been erased. But as long as we know the man sitting beside us in the dark, we are never truly lost. The ghost in the silent woods was not the enemy. The ghost was the old world, the world that believed in impassable forests and honorable, slow-moving lines. That world had died among the crushed moss and the broken branches. But as the boys huddled together for warmth, sharing a single, stale piece of bread and breathing in the cool, damp air of the cave, they proved that the human spirit cannot be so easily crushed. The fortress of wood and stone had failed them. The generals far away had been completely blind. But in the terrifying face of an unstoppable machine, they had found the only true fortress that ever really matters. They had found each other. And as the long, dark night stretched on, filled with the roar of the new century pouring through the ancient trees, they simply closed their eyes, held on to their quiet resilience, and waited for the dawn. The salt air tasted of burning oil and impossible distances, yet the ocean was the only direction left to walk. To understand the terrifying, sweeping success of the new mechanical storm, you only needed to look at where it had pushed the old world. It had pushed it all the way to the very edge of the map. The vast, green continent, with its ancient forests and winding roads, had been swallowed in a matter of weeks by an enemy that moved faster than the human mind could comprehend. And now, the land had simply run out. Imagine standing on a wide, flat expanse of pale sand, beneath a sky heavily bruised with smoke. The tide is pulling gently at your boots. Behind you is the roaring, unstoppable machine that has shattered the spring. In front of you is nothing but the cold, gray, indifferent expanse of the sea. This was the quiet, profound desperation of the beach. It was not a place of loud, frantic panic, but a landscape of deep, heavy exhaustion. Hundreds of thousands of men, wrapped in damp wool and carrying the weight of a sudden, incomprehensible defeat, stood in long, winding lines that snaked down into the freezing surf. They looked like statues carved from sorrow, waiting for a miracle they were too tired to pray for. Among them was a young soldier named Thomas. He was barely 20 years old, a boy from a quiet, landlocked farming village where the loudest sound was the church bell on a Sunday morning. Now, he stood with the icy water of the channel swirling around his knees, his heavy uniform soaking up the sea, making his legs feel like lead. Thomas was so profoundly tired that he could no longer feel fear. The adrenaline that had carried him through the terrifying, collapsing weeks of the retreat had entirely burned away, leaving only a hollow, vibrating ache in his chest. He held his rifle loosely in one hand, not as a weapon, but as a walking stick, a simple piece of wood and metal to keep him upright in the shifting sand. With his other hand, he reached into his breast pocket and traced the outline of a small, water-damaged photograph wrapped in wax paper. It was a picture of his family's front porch. He closed his eyes, listening to the rhythmic, hypnotic lapping of the waves against his thighs, and tried to transport his mind away from the beach. He thought of the smell of his mother's baking bread, the soft, golden light of the late afternoon filtering through the oak trees, the familiar, comforting creak of the wooden floorboards in his childhood bedroom. He stood there, freezing and defeated, simply facing home. The enemy, in their grand, armored columns, had halted just miles away. Their success had been so absolute, so overwhelmingly fast, that they had surprised even themselves. The massive, coordinated machine paused at the edge of the wetlands, catching its breath, completely unsure of how to fight the ocean. They looked at the trapped men on the beach and believed that the story was over. They believed that a broken army, stripped of its armor and backed against the sea, was an army that no longer mattered. It was a fatal miscalculation born of ultimate pride. The machine understood the mathematics of destruction, but it entirely failed to understand the quiet, stubborn mathematics of love. Across the water, on the gentle, green coasts of the island, the morning air was perfectly still. In a small, sleepy harbor, an older man named Arthur was kneeling on the wooden deck of his pleasure cruiser, the Wanderer. The boat was his pride and joy, a beautiful, polished thing of varnished mahogany and gleaming brass, built for lazy Sunday afternoons sailing up the quiet rivers, carrying nothing heavier than a picnic basket and a thermos of tea. Arthur was a man of peace, a retired clockmaker who spent his days tending to his rose bushes and watching the tides. But when the quiet, desperate call came over the wireless, a plea for anyone with a boat, no matter how small, to sail into the dark and help bring the boys home, Arthur did not hesitate. He did not pack weapons. He did not wear a uniform. He simply walked into his kitchen, kissed his wife's cheek, and began to fill every thermos he owned with hot, sweet tea. He gathered every spare wool blanket from the cedar chests, folding them neatly on the upholstered seats of his small cabin. He filled a tin box with shortbread biscuits. He was not a soldier going to war. He was a father going to pick up the children of his nation. When Arthur guided the Wanderer out of the safe, familiar harbor and into the open channel, he was not alone. The water was alive with 1,000 tiny, bobbing wakes. It was the armada of the ordinary. There were tugboats and fishing trawlers, wooden ferries and sleek sailing yachts, lifeboats and paddle steamers. They were piloted by bankers and bakers, by grandfathers in heavy wool sweaters, by young boys who knew the currents better than they knew their school books. They sailed into a sea that, by some quiet grace of the universe, had flattened into a calm, glassy millpond. The wind had died down to a gentle whisper, as if the earth itself were holding its breath, granting this fragile, makeshift fleet a smooth passage across the dangerous expanse. Back on the wide, smoky beach, the men had been standing in the water for days. Thomas was shivering violently, his lips blue, his eyes heavy with a sleep he dared not surrender to. The water was up to his waist now, cold and heavy. He looked out into the gray mist that hung over the water, expecting nothing. They had lost the land. They had lost the sky. They were simply waiting for the inevitable end. But then, the mist began to part. It did not reveal the massive, imposing silhouettes of grand naval warships. Instead, breaking through the fog, came 1,000 ripples of color. A beautiful, chaotic mosaic of civilian life, painted in bright blues, varnished wood, and peeling white paint. The sound that drifted over the water was not the roar of heavy naval guns, but the sputtering, rhythmic coughing of hundreds of small, civilian engines. A collective, breathless murmur rippled through the thousands of exhausted men standing in the surf. It was the sound of profound, disbelieving awe. Thomas watched as a small, polished wooden cruiser, entirely out of place in a war zone, drifted slowly toward his section of the water. He saw the name The Wanderer painted in gold leaf on the bow. At the helm stood an older man in a yellow fisherman's coat, steering with a quiet, focused determination. When the water grew too shallow for the boat to come any closer, Arthur cut the engine. He dropped a small anchor and stepped to the side, leaning over the low wooden railing, reaching his calloused, wrinkled hand down toward the dark water. "Come on then, lad," Arthur called out, his voice carrying the gentle, familiar cadence of home. "Let's get you out of the cold." Thomas waded forward, his legs numb, his boots dragging in the heavy sand. He reached up, his freezing, trembling fingers closing around Arthur's warm, strong grip. With a heavy, splashing heave, the clockmaker pulled the young soldier up and over the gunwale, letting him collapse onto the soft, carpeted deck of the pleasure boat. The physical sensation of that moment was a profound, overwhelming shock to the soul. After weeks of retreating across burning fields, after days of standing in the terrifying, exposed surf, Thomas was suddenly surrounded by the smell of old varnish, brass polish, and peppermint. He felt the solid, dry wood beneath his hands. Arthur did not ask him about the battle. He did not ask him where his unit was, or why they had lost the continent. He simply knelt beside the shivering boy, wrapping a thick, dry-wool blanket tightly around his shoulders. He unscrewed the cup of a thermos and poured a steaming measure of tea, pressing the warm metal into Thomas's shaking hands. "Drink that down, son," Arthur whispered softly, his eyes crinkling with a gentle, fatherly kindness. "It has plenty of sugar. You're safe now." Thomas lifted the cup to his lips. The tea was impossibly sweet, hot and rich, burning a path of glorious, comforting warmth down his throat. He looked up at Arthur, and for the first time since the sky had fallen weeks ago, the tears came. They were not tears of sorrow or of fear, but of an absolute, exhausting, beautiful relief. All around them, the sea was filled with thousands of these tiny, miraculous moments of salvation. Small wooden boats were pulling exhausted men from the dark water, filling their decks until they were sitting inches from the waves. Strangers were wrapping their own coats around shivering shoulders. Fishermen were handing out dry biscuits and quiet smiles. It was a retreat, yes. It was the bitter end of a terrible defeat on the land. But on the water, it was a magnificent victory of the human spirit. The terrifying success of the enemy's mechanical momentum had been designed to crush the will of a nation, to prove that their cold, coordinated iron was the only force left in the world. But iron sinks. What the enemy could not measure, what they could not conquer with speed or terror, was the gentle, stubborn resilience of a quiet people who simply refused to leave their boys in the dark. As the Wanderer slowly turned its bow back toward the white cliffs, the low hum of its engine became a soothing, rhythmic lullaby. The sky began to clear, revealing the soft, silver light of a rising moon. Thomas lay on the wooden deck, wrapped in his blanket, the sweet taste of tea still on his tongue. He listened to the water rushing gently against the hull, carrying them away from the smoke and the terror. He closed his eyes, surrounded by the sleeping forms of a dozen other rescued men. They had lost their rifles. They had lost the old world. But they had kept their lives. They had been pulled from the edge of the abyss by the hands of bakers and clockmakers, by 1,000 small ripples of kindness that the giant machine could never understand. The young soldier finally let go of the tension that had held him together for a month. He sank into the soft wood of the deck, lulled by the rocking of the sea, and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, traveling safely over the quiet water, heading slowly, gently, toward home. The cobblestones were warm with the early summer sun, but the heart of the city had already turned to ice. It is a profound and unsettling thing to see a magnificent city simply stop breathing. For centuries, this was a place defined by its beautiful, chaotic noise. It was the city of artists and dreamers, of lovers arguing affectionately over small cafe tables, of flower vendors calling out the morning prices, and of accordion music drifting softly down the winding alleys. It was a place that wore its vibrant, beating heart on its sleeve, dancing to a rhythm entirely its own. But as the sweet, fragrant days of early summer arrived, a strange and heavy silence descended over the wide, tree-lined boulevards. The cafes were locked, their woven chairs stacked neatly behind darkened glass. The flower stands were empty, leaving only the faint, lingering scent of crushed petals on the pavement. The great iron-wrought balconies, usually draped with laundry and echoing with conversation, stood completely deserted. The storm that had shattered the borders and swallowed the countryside was now standing at the very gates of the capital. To understand the terrifying success of this moment, we must understand the deepest, most quiet fears of the human heart. The enemy had built a machine of such overwhelming momentum that it did not just break armies, it broke the will to resist. The leaders of the beautiful city looked at their ancient monuments, their magnificent cathedrals reaching up toward the sky, and their sweeping bridges crossing the gentle river. And then, they looked at the smoking ruins of the nations that had tried to stand in the way of the iron tide. A quiet, agonizing decision was made in the dark. To save the stones of the city, they would have to surrender its soul. They declared the capital an open city. There would be no barricades in the streets. There would be no last, desperate stand among the cafes and the bookshops. It was a decision born of a profound, generational exhaustion. The older men and women, the ones with silver in their hair, remembered all too well the devastating cost of the last great conflict. They had already given their youth, their brothers, and their husbands to the mud and the wire. They simply had no blood left to give. And so, they waited. In a small, dusty bookshop near the edge of the gentle river, an older man named Henri sat behind a heavy wooden counter. The shop smelled of binding glue, dry paper, and the comforting vanilla scent of aging books. Henri had spent his entire life surrounded by the beautiful, printed thoughts of poets and philosophers. He believed in the power of words to elevate the human spirit. But on this quiet morning, words felt entirely useless. Henri was carefully tying a stack of personal letters together with a thin piece of twine. His hands, spotted with age and ink, moved slowly. The shop was closed, the heavy wooden shutters drawn tight against the street, leaving only thin, golden slivers of sunlight to pierce the gloom. The dust motes danced slowly in the beams of light, completely indifferent to the sorrow of the world. He pulled a clean sheet of paper toward him and picked up his fountain pen, writing a letter to his daughter, who had fled to the countryside days before. "My beautiful girl," he wrote, the nib scratching softly against the silence. "The city is holding its breath today. It is a strange, terrible kind of mourning. We are grieving for a loss that has not yet completely arrived, but we know is standing just outside the door. I walked along the river this morning. The water is still so beautiful, still reflecting the sky just as it did yesterday. It feels like a betrayal that the sun can shine so brightly on a day our freedom is packed away into boxes. I am staying with the books. I cannot bear to leave them. Keep your head down, my darling, and look for the stars. I love you." He signed his name, his hand trembling just enough to blur the fresh ink. The psychological defeat of a nation does not happen with a loud crash. It happens in these quiet, devastating moments of resignation, when the people simply fold their hands in their laps and accept that the old world is gone. The success of the advancing army was absolute. They had paralyzed their opponents with speed, and now they were simply walking in to claim the prize. When the morning finally came, and the boots of the conquerors touched the ancient cobblestones of the grandest avenue in the world, there was no thunder of cannons. There was only a rhythmic, mechanical sound. A unified, terrifying marching of thousands of heavy boots hitting the pavement in perfect, unyielding unison. It was the sound of the new rhythm of the world, rigid and cold, marching straight into the heart of a city built on romance and rebellion. Along the wide sidewalks, under the shade of the blooming chestnut trees, the citizens gathered. They did not come to fight. They did not bring stones or shouts of defiance. They came because they were drawn by a morbid, breaking heart, needing to witness the unbelievable reality with their own eyes. Among the crowd stood a young woman named Elise. She wore a simple, pale dress, her hands clutching the leather handlebars of a bicycle she had been too tired to ride. She stood pressed against the edge of the street, watching the endless columns of gray uniforms move past the magnificent arches and the towering monuments of her home. The conquerors rode on their dark horses and sat in their perfectly painted machines, their faces stern and proud. They looked at the beautiful architecture, their eyes sweeping over the cafes and the theaters, claiming it all without firing a single shot. They had achieved the ultimate psychological victory. They had walked into the jewel of the continent without shedding a drop of blood. Elise did not look at their faces. She looked at the ground, watching the heavy boots crush a fallen chestnut blossom against the stone. And then, softly, she began to weep. It was not a loud, dramatic wailing. It was a silent, steady falling of tears. The profound heartbreak of a broken morale is a heavy, suffocating weight that presses behind the eyes until the sorrow simply overflows. She cried for the beautiful, noisy days that were gone. She cried for the terrifying, uncertain days that lay ahead. She cried because the city she loved was being held captive, and there was absolutely nothing she could do to stop it. All down the boulevard, this quiet, devastating scene repeated itself. Grown men, veterans of older wars with medals tucked away in their drawers, stood with their hats in their hands, the tears shining on their withered cheeks. Mothers pulled their children close, hiding the faces of the young against their skirts, not wanting them to see the shadow falling over their home. They stood together on the sidewalks, a sea of weeping people, forced to watch the physical manifestation of their own defeat parade through their living room. This was the surreal nature of the bloodless occupation. The buildings were perfectly intact. The bridges were unburnt. The stained glass in the great cathedrals still caught the morning light, throwing beautiful, colored patterns across the cool stone floors. But the spirit of the city had been hollowed out. The enemy had succeeded in capturing the architecture, but what they really wanted was to break the belief that anyone, anywhere, could ever stand against them. Yet, even in the very center of this profound, crushing sorrow, the human heart cannot be completely turned to stone. As the long, terrible day slowly faded into a bruised and heavy twilight, the marching finally ceased. The conquerors settled into the grand hotels, hanging their harsh, dark flags from the wrought iron balconies. A strict curfew was ordered. The city was told to extinguish its lights, to retreat into the shadows, and to be perfectly, absolutely still. The city of light went dark. But inside the tall, narrow apartment buildings, behind the heavy velvet curtains and the closed wooden shutters, the quiet resilience of ordinary people began to stir, just a fraction of an inch. In her small kitchen on the 4th floor, Elise wiped her face with a cool, damp cloth. The tears had stopped, leaving behind a dry, aching exhaustion. She lit a single, small candle, placing it on the center of her wooden dining table. There was a soft, hesitant knock at her door. Elise opened it slowly to find her neighbor, an older woman who rarely spoke, standing in the dim hallway. The woman did not say a word. She simply held out a small, chipped ceramic plate. On it rested a single, perfect slice of soft cheese and a small heel of fresh bread. Elise looked at the humble offering, feeling a sudden, warm tightness in her throat. She looked into the older woman's eyes, seeing the same raw, heavy sorrow that she carried in her own. But beneath the sorrow, there was a spark. A tiny, unspoken understanding that the streets outside might belong to the strangers in gray, but the warmth of the hallway, the sharing of bread, the quiet dignity of neighborly love, that still belonged to them. Elise took the plate, her hands trembling slightly, and offered a soft, whispered word of thanks. The neighbor nodded, a slow, gentle bow of the head, and returned to her own darkened rooms. The enemy had achieved a terrifying, sweeping success. They had used speed and terror to break the borders, and they had used overwhelming intimidation to break the morale of a great nation. They believed that because the city was silent, the city was dead. They mistook the tears on the boulevards for an eternal surrender. But as Henri sat in his darkened bookshop, guarding his beloved pages, and as Elise ate her small piece of bread by the light of a single, flickering candle, the truth of the world remained hidden from the conquerors. You can occupy a street. You can silence a cafe. You can demand the keys to the greatest buildings in the world. But you can never, truly, occupy the quiet, beautiful spaces of the human soul. The tears had fallen, washing the cobblestones with the heavy grief of a broken spring. But when the crying was done, the people of the silent city would wipe their eyes, look into the dark, and begin the long, slow, quiet work of remembering how to hope. The night was absolute. The horizon was entirely enclosed. But in millions of quiet rooms, beneath the unblinking gaze of the stars, the people simply held their breath, wrapped their arms around their memories, and prepared to wait for the morning. The shadow of the giant did not fall all at once. It crept across the continent like the slow, quiet closing of a heavy, oak door. When the roar of the engines finally faded and the dust of the retreating armies settled into the earth, a new and profoundly heavy silence took hold. The sudden, violent storm that had swept across the map was over, but it had left behind a strange, suffocating weather. This was the season of the long shadow. It was a time when the physical battles of the borders were replaced by a quiet, invisible war waged entirely within the human mind. To understand the deepest, most enduring success of the conquerors in these early days, we must look past the captured cities and the folded horizons. We must look at the stories people began to tell themselves in the dark. The greatest weapon forged by the advancing empire was not made of steel or iron. It was made of myth. It was a carefully constructed, brilliantly polished illusion of absolute, unbroken invincibility. They wanted the world to believe that they were not merely an army of men, but a terrifying force of nature, a tidal wave that could not be reasoned with, an earthquake that could not be stopped. And as the summer gave way to autumn, this dark, heavy propaganda began to take root in the weary hearts of everyday people. In a narrow, winding alleyway in a city of ancient spires, an aging clockmaker named Anton sat behind the glass of his shop window. The room around him was a sanctuary of soft ticking and gentle chimes, filled with the comforting, predictable geometry of brass gears and coiled springs. Anton was a man who understood the fragile nature of time and the delicate balance required to keep a machine running. Every afternoon, at the exact same hour, Anton would pause his work. He would gently set down his magnifying loupe, wipe his hands on his canvas apron, and look out through the glass. Down the cobblestone street, the daily patrol would pass. It was always the same. A line of soldiers in immaculate, dark uniforms, their boots striking the ancient stones in perfect, terrifying unison. Click, clack. Click, clack. It was the rhythm of the new world. It was a step that never faltered, never stumbled, and never seemed to tire. Anton watched them with a heavy, sinking resignation. In the town square, massive, stark posters had been pasted over the old advertisements for soap and theater shows. The posters depicted giants of industry and war, men with faces carved from marble, looking out toward a 1,000-year horizon. Between the flawless marching outside his window and the towering, unblinking faces on the walls, Anton felt the crushing weight of the myth pressing against his chest. How do you fight a machine that never winds down? How do you resist a force that seems completely immune to the exhaustion that plagues ordinary men? This was the psychological paralysis that settled over the continent. The people did not wake up every day looking for ways to rebel. They woke up simply trying to find a way to breathe beneath the weight of the giant. They began to believe the story they were being told. They looked at their own tired hands, their worn shoes, and their dwindling pantries, and they compared themselves to the pristine, mechanical perfection of their occupiers. In a small, drafty apartment on the second floor of a gray building, a mother named Clara sat at her kitchen table in the dim light of early evening. She was carefully darning a hole in the knee of her young son's woolen trousers. The needle moved in a slow, hypnotic rhythm, weaving a delicate web of thread over the worn fabric. Clara was a woman of quiet, enduring strength. But the endless, perfect rhythm of the occupation was wearing her down, sanding away her hope like a river flowing over a stone. She kept a small diary hidden beneath the floorboard under her bed, a place to whisper the thoughts she dared not speak aloud. She paused, resting her forehead in her hand, and pulled the small leather book toward her. "The streets are so quiet now," she wrote, the pencil marking the paper with a soft, scratching sound. "We walk with our heads down, careful not to meet their eyes. They stand on the corners, tall and unmoving, like statues that have somehow learned to breathe. My little boy asked me today when the tall men in the gray coats will go home. I did not know what to tell him. It feels as though they have always been here, and that they always will be. It feels as though the sky itself has changed its color to match their uniforms. We are living inside their story now, and in their story, they never lose." This was the quiet tragedy of the myth. It stole the future. It convinced millions of gentle, resilient people that their struggles were meaningless, that history had reached its final, unchangeable chapter. The heavy, quiet resignation was not born of cowardice, it was born of an overwhelming, perfectly orchestrated awe. When an empire moves with such absolute precision, it tricks the eye into believing it is flawless. But time, as Anton the clockmaker knew so well, has a way of revealing the hidden flaws in every machine. No spring can stay tightly coiled forever. No step is truly, eternally unbroken. It happened on a Tuesday, late in the afternoon, as a cold, bitter rain began to fall over the city. The sky bruised to a deep, bruised purple, and the cobblestones became slick with water. Anton was sitting in his shop, the warm, yellow glow of his desk lamp pushing back against the gloom of the street. Outside, the daily patrol was making its way down the alley. The rain was falling in heavy, driving sheets, turning the world into a blurred painting of grays and shadows. Anton watched through the water-streaked glass. He saw the line of soldiers, their dark coats heavy with the rain. And then, he saw it. The soldier at the very back of the line, a boy who could not have been more than 18 years old, stepped on a smooth, wet stone. His boot slipped. The perfect, mechanical rhythm shattered. The boy stumbled, his arms flailing wildly for a brief, frantic second to catch his balance, his heavy rifle clattering loudly against the wall of the bakery next door. The boy caught himself, his face flushing a deep, embarrassed red. He quickly scrambled back into formation, desperately trying to catch the rhythm of the men ahead of him. But as he hurried past the clock shop, Anton saw the boy's face clearly through the glass. The mask of the invincible Titan was entirely gone. In its place was just a terrified, soaked, miserable teenager. The boy wiped the freezing rain from his eyes with a trembling, gloveless hand. He looked incredibly small. He looked cold. He looked profoundly homesick. Anton sat back in his wooden chair, the breath catching softly in his throat. It was a tiny, insignificant moment. A slipped boot on a wet stone. But to Anton, it was like watching a crack form in the foundation of the world. In that single, fleeting second, the grand, terrifying myth of the unbroken step evaporated into the rainy air. They were not gods. They were not machines carved from iron and storm. They were just men. They were boys wrapped in heavy coats, far from their mothers, marching through the rain because they were told to. They bled. They slipped. They felt the biting chill of the autumn wind. A profound, quiet warmth began to spread through Anton's chest. It was not the sudden, fiery heat of a revolution. It was the soft, enduring ember of truth. The giant was a fiction. The shadow was only a trick of the light. That evening, Anton closed his shop. He walked upstairs to his small living quarters above the ticking clocks. He made himself a cup of tea, holding the warm ceramic mug in his withered hands. He looked out his window at the dark city, listening to the rain fall softly against the rooftops. The occupation was still there. The heavy coats and the dark flags still claimed the streets. The world was still broken. But Anton's spirit was no longer captive to the myth. This gentle awakening began to happen in 1,000 small, quiet ways across the continent. Clara, the mother darning clothes in the dim light, saw a foreign soldier drop a letter from his pocket and frantically search the muddy street to find it, his face pale with worry. A baker watched an occupier secretly feed a piece of bread to a stray dog, revealing a softness the uniform tried to hide. A school teacher noticed that the guards stationed at the bridge shivered just as violently in the snow as the local villagers did. They began to see the human seams holding the monster together. And in that quiet realization, the heavy, suffocating resignation began to lift, ever so slightly. The people did not rise up immediately. They knew the giant was still dangerous, still armed, and still heavy. But they stopped believing in its immortality. They learned to live in the shadow, but they no longer believed the shadow was the entire world. They returned to their quiet lives with a new, secret patience. They swept their steps. They taught their children how to read. They planted small, defiant gardens in their window boxes, waiting for the spring. They listened to the marching boots in the street, the click, clack that echoed against the old buildings. But now, they listened with a different ear. They listened not for the terrible perfection, but for the inevitable pause. They listened for the stumble. They knew, with the quiet, unshakable certainty of people who understand the enduring rhythms of the earth, that no one can march forever without needing to rest. The myth of the unbroken step had captured the world for a season. It had commanded the awe of millions. But as the people closed their eyes each night, tucked beneath their wool blankets in the quiet dark, they held on to the simple, beautiful truth. The giant was only a man. And a man, no matter how tall he stands, must eventually sleep. And so, the quiet continent learned to wait in the dark, tending to the small flames of their own humanity, patiently watching for the morning. The summer sky was so breathtakingly blue that it felt almost cruel to look up and see the scars being carved across it. It was a season of golden wheat and heavy, sweet orchards, a time when the earth usually asks for nothing more than a quiet harvest. The island nation, separated from the broken continent by a narrow, restless strip of dark water, was holding its breath. The great, mechanical beast that had swallowed the roads and folded the horizons of Europe had finally run out of land. It stood on the sandy shores across the channel, its heavy iron tracks resting at the edge of the sea. But a machine built on momentum cannot simply stop. It must continue to consume. And so, the shadow that had marched across the earth was forced to grow wings, lifting its gaze from the mud and the cobblestones toward the vast, open vault of the heavens. To the people waiting below, in the sleepy villages and the sprawling, brick-lined cities, the war suddenly took on a profound, surreal quality. It was no longer a thing of trembling earth and crushed fences. It had become a distant, almost silent dance performed at the very roof of the world. In a small, overgrown garden tucked behind a stone cottage in Kent, an older man named Edward stood with a wicker basket hooked over his arm. He was moving slowly among the tall, unruly rose bushes, his weathered hands carefully snipping the faded blooms. The air smelled of damp earth, sweet pollen, and the faint, salty breeze rolling in from the coast. It was a perfectly ordinary, peaceful morning. Then, Edward heard the hum. It was a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to come not from the horizon, but from the very air itself. He did not run for the underground shelters. He simply lowered his heavy iron shears, tipped his head back, and squinted into the glaring sunlight. High above him, so high that the machines themselves were entirely invisible, a strange and terrible beauty was unfolding. The deep azure canvas of the sky was being marked by long, sweeping lines of pure white. They were contrails, the frozen breath of desperately straining engines, weaving over and under each other like silver threads being pulled through a loom. From the quiet sanctuary of the garden, there was no sound of shouting, no terrible crash of metal. There was only the low, steady drone, like the sound of a million bees trapped in a jar. Edward watched the white lines loop and spiral, blooming into delicate arcs before slowly dissolving into the wind. It looked like a graceful, ethereal ballet. But Edward knew, with a heavy, aching heart, that inside those tiny silver sparks, young boys were fighting for the very survival of the world. This was the terrifying paradox of the late summer. The greatest struggle for freedom was happening in a place of absolute, freezing silence, high above the warm, green earth. To understand why the unstoppable machine finally began to stutter, we must understand the nature of the sky. You cannot pave the clouds. You cannot occupy the air with heavy boots or dark flags. The sky is an equalizer. It strips away the overwhelming weight of armored columns and leaves only the fragile, beating heart of the pilot. Hidden away in the gentle folds of the countryside, completely camouflaged by ancient oak trees and rolling pastures, were the small, grassy airfields. They did not look like fortresses. They looked like meadows. On the edge of one of these fields, a young man named Julian lay in a canvas deck chair, his face turned toward the sun. He wore a heavy sheepskin jacket over his uniform, his silk scarf loosened around his neck. Beside him, a small, scruffy terrier was curled into a tight ball, sleeping peacefully in the warm grass. Julian was barely out of university. A year ago, his greatest worry had been passing his examinations and finding the courage to ask a girl to dance at the village hall. Now, his eyes carried the deep, haunted weariness of an old man. The dark circles beneath them spoke of too many dawn patrols, too much bitter coffee, and the heavy, unspeakable sorrow of watching the empty chairs at the mess hall multiply week by week. He was writing a letter on a small pad resting on his knee, the pencil moving in slow, lazy loops. "My dearest sister," he wrote, the paper fluttering slightly in the breeze. "The sun is so warm today it almost makes me forget the cold up there. Please tell Mother I received the fruitcake, though it was slightly crushed in the post. It tasted like home. We do a lot of waiting here. We drink tea, we play cards, and we try not to look at the clock. It is a strange life, living entirely in the minutes between the ringing of the bell. I promise to be careful. The sky is so very big, and I am so very small." He did not finish the sentence. A sharp, shrill ringing tore through the quiet afternoon. It was the scramble bell. Julian did not panic. There was no time for fear, and there was no energy left for drama. He simply dropped the notepad, gave the sleeping dog a gentle pat on the head, and broke into a heavy, sprinting run toward his waiting machine. The transition was jarring, a violent shift from the warm, fragrant grass to the cramped, smelling confines of metal, leather, and high-octane fuel. Within minutes, he was being pulled away from the earth, the green field shrinking below him into a patchwork quilt of tiny, harmless squares. He climbed into the freezing, thin air, his breath frosting on the glass of his canopy, rising to meet the dark tide rolling in from the sea. While Julian ascended into the cold, another quiet battle was being fought in the warm, dimly lit rooms deep beneath the earth. In a windowless bunker, the air thick with the smell of stale tobacco and hot radio tubes, a young woman named Beatrice stood over a massive, painted map of the coastline. She wore a headset over her dark hair, listening intently to the crackling voices echoing from the radar stations along the cliffs. In her hand, she held a long wooden croupier's stick. With slow, deliberate movements, she pushed small, painted wooden blocks across the map. The blocks represented the incoming shadow. And the other blocks, the ones she moved with a protective, almost tender care, represented Julian and his friends. Beatrice was the tether. She was the invisible string connecting the boys in the freezing blue to the safety of the earth. The room around her was wrapped in a hushed, concentrated silence. There was no shouting, only the calm, rhythmic murmuring of coordinates and headings. More angels, she whispered softly to herself, pushing Julian's wooden marker higher up the board, willing him to climb faster, to find the sun before the enemy did. She did not know his face. She did not know his name. But she felt the immense, crushing weight of his life in the palm of her hand. Every time a block was removed from the board, a quiet, invisible tear fell in the dark room. Beatrice swallowed the lump in her throat, blinked away the fatigue burning in her eyes, and continued to move the pieces. She was fighting the unstoppable machine with nothing but a wooden stick and a quiet, unbroken focus. And slowly, miraculously, the momentum began to shift. It did not happen in a single, glorious moment. It happened in 1,000 tiny, exhausting increments. High above the English gardens, the dark wings of the conqueror were meeting something they had never encountered before, a quiet, stubborn determination that absolutely refused to fold. The pilots of the island were hopelessly outnumbered. They were flying patched-up machines, running on fumes and a desperate, frayed courage. But they were fighting over their own homes. When they looked down, they did not see a map to be conquered. They saw the winding river where they had learned to swim. They saw the church spires of their childhood. They saw the gardens where men like Edward were standing, looking up at them with hands pressed over their hearts. This profound love for the quiet, green earth gave them a strength that the mechanical giants simply could not calculate. Day after day, the silver threads wove across the azure sky. And day after day, the great, invincible tide was broken against them, scattering back across the water like waves hitting a seawall. For the everyday people watching from the ground, the realization came slowly, like the gentle breaking of a fever. Edward stood in his garden as the late afternoon sun began to dip below the trees, painting the fading contrails in soft shades of peach and lavender. The hum of the engines was dying away, receding back toward the continent. He leaned heavily against his wooden fence, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of awe. He had spent the last year listening to the radio broadcasts, hearing the terrifying stories of nations collapsing in days, of a machine so perfect it could not be stopped. He had believed, as so many had, that the darkness was inevitable. But looking up at the scarred, beautiful sky, he realized the myth was finally breaking. The unstoppable force had met a fragile, human wall, and the wall was holding. The giant was bleeding in the sky. It was a delicate, precious victory. It was not a triumph of grand empires, but a triumph of exhausted boys drinking lukewarm tea, of young women pushing wooden blocks in the dark, and of ordinary people refusing to look away from the heavens. As the evening shadows lengthened, Julian brought his tired machine back down to the grassy field. The engine sputtered and coughed into silence. He climbed out of the cockpit, his legs shaking so terribly he could barely stand. His face was covered in dark soot, save for the pale circles around his eyes where his goggles had been. He walked slowly across the grass, feeling the solid, beautiful earth beneath his boots. His little terrier ran to meet him, barking happily, dancing around his weary feet. Julian dropped to his knees, burying his face in the dog's rough fur, breathing in the scent of the meadow. He was too tired to speak, too tired to even weep. He just held on, anchored to the world he had fought so desperately to keep safe. The night finally fell over the island, bringing a cool, gentle breeze that swept the last of the silver sparks from the azure canvas. The sky became a sea of quiet, unblinking stars. The world was still broken, and the long, dark years still lay ahead. But as the people of the island drew their heavy curtains and struck the matches to light their lamps, they did so with a new, quiet grace. The momentum had been challenged. The shadow had been held back. And in the quiet dark, they finally allowed themselves to believe that the morning would eventually come. The earth above was turning to ash, but deep beneath the pavement, a million quiet heartbeats were keeping the city alive. As the golden days of summer slowly gave way to a bruised and heavy autumn, the great, mechanical storm that had swept across the continent found itself frustrated by the vast blue sky. The enemy, having failed to break the island's defenders in the clouds, turned its heavy, dark gaze toward the earth below. To the minds of the conquerors, the mathematics of victory were simple. They believed that if you could not defeat an army, you must instead break the spirit of the people who stood behind it. They believed in the terrible, cold logic of terror. They assumed that a city subjected to a rain of fire would simply collapse into panic, that the sheer, overwhelming noise of the night would dissolve the bonds of society, leaving only a fractured, terrified population begging for peace. It was a tactic that had worked so devastatingly well in the early days of their march. The shadow had always succeeded by moving faster and striking harder than the human mind could comprehend. But a machine built of iron and spite cannot calculate the stubborn, enduring warmth of the human soul. When the sun dipped below the horizon, and the harvest moon rose large and pale in the smoky sky, the warning sirens would begin their mournful, rising wail across the sprawling city. It was a sound designed to inspire absolute dread. Yet, if you were to stand on the cobblestone streets as the twilight faded, you would not see a frantic, screaming stampede. You would see a slow, quiet, and profoundly dignified migration. Families stepped out of their brick row houses, carrying the fragile, beautiful pieces of their ordinary lives. Mothers carried heavy wool blankets and thermoses filled with hot, sweet tea. Fathers carried small, cardboard suitcases packed with a change of clothes and precious family photographs. Children walked in their pajamas, clutching worn teddy bears and dog-eared storybooks against their chests. They walked away from their fragile roofs and descended into the earth. Down the long, stationary escalators they went, moving deep into the winding tunnels of the London Underground. The air here was entirely different from the cool, damp breeze of the autumn night. It smelled of ozone, warm metallic dust, and the heavy, comforting scent of thousands of people seeking sanctuary together. The tiled walls of the subterranean stations, curving gently like the ribs of a massive, sleeping whale, became the new walls of their world. On the concrete platforms, inches from the dark, silent tracks, the city built a new, temporary kind of home. In a small alcove near the bottom of the stairs, a young woman named Evelyn knelt on a spread of old newspapers, carefully smoothing out a thick, knitted blanket. Beside her, her two young daughters were already curled together, their even breathing a soft, rhythmic counterpoint to the low murmur of the crowd. Evelyn pulled her woolen cardigan tight against the draft and reached into her canvas bag, pulling out a small notebook and a stub of pencil. She held a small, battery-operated lantern between her knees, casting a warm, golden circle of light over the pages. She was writing a letter to her husband, stationed far away on a dark, rolling sea. "My dearest," she wrote, her handwriting small and precise. "We are living like badgers now, tucked away safely beneath the roots of the city. You would hardly believe the sight of it. The platform is a sea of pillows and teacups. Mrs. Higgins from down the lane is sleeping right next to the ticket booth, and the baker from the corner has brought a whole tin of stale biscuits to share with the children. The noise up above is terrible, I will not lie to you. But down here, there is only the sound of breathing and the quiet shuffling of cards. The children are sleeping soundly. They think it is a grand adventure, a camping trip beneath the pavement. We miss you terribly, but we are keeping the light on for you." Elias, an older man with silver hair and a deeply lined face, was sitting a few yards away, his back resting against an advertising poster for seaside holidays. He had spent his entire life working in the loud, clanking factories of the city, a man used to the rough, solitary edges of the world. But here, in the dim, humid air of the tunnel, the hard edges were softening. He watched a young mother struggle to mix powdered milk in a bottle with shaking hands. Without a word, Elias reached over, took his own heavy wool coat, and draped it gently over the mother's shivering shoulders. He offered her a warm, crinkling smile, entirely devoid of pity, filled only with the quiet solidarity of shared endurance. The mother nodded, a profound, silent thank you passing between them in the dark. This was the magnificent failure of the terror from the sky. The enemy had dropped their fire to isolate the people, to make every man, woman, and child feel completely, hopelessly alone in the dark. But the fire had done the exact opposite. It had stripped away the fences and the front doors. It had forced the city together, shoulder to shoulder, breath to breath. Strangers who had lived on the same street for years without ever speaking were now sharing sandwiches, sharing blankets, sharing the deep, unspoken burden of simply surviving the night. As the hours stretched on, the dull, rhythmic thudding of the bombs would occasionally shake the earth high above. A fine, white dust would drift down from the curved ceiling, settling like a strange, dry snow over the sleeping faces. The vibration would travel through the concrete, a physical reminder of the mechanical giant trying to crush them from the clouds. During these moments, when the fear threatened to creep in and steal the breath from the room, the true resilience of the underground world revealed itself. From further down the platform, a soft, wheezing sound began to breathe into the quiet air. An older gentleman named Mr. Harrison had unbuckled a battered leather case and pulled out a worn accordion. He did not play loud, defiant marches. He did not try to compete with the terrible noise of the sky. He played slow, gentle music hall tunes. He played soft lullabies that drifted down the tunnels like a warm breeze. Slowly, voices began to join him. It started as a whisper, a timid humming from a group of women knitting in the shadows. Then, a few men joined in, their deep voices adding a rich, steady foundation to the melody. Soon, the entire platform was singing softly in the dark. It was a sound of absolute, heartbreaking beauty. It was the sound of a people building an invisible shield out of harmony and shared memory. They sang to drown out the engines. They sang to soothe the waking infants. They sang to remind themselves that they were still human, still alive, and still entirely unbroken. The enemy had successfully turned the night sky into a nightmare, but they could not touch the music beneath the pavement. The logic of the machine was fundamentally flawed because it only understood the breaking of physical things. It understood how to shatter glass and splinter wood. It understood how to turn brick into dust. But it did not understand that a city is not made of brick and glass. A city is made of the people who sweep the dust. When the morning finally came, and the long, steady note of the all-clear siren echoed down the escalator shafts, the great subterranean camp would begin to stir. Blankets were folded. Thermoses were packed away. The people of the city rubbed the sleep from their eyes and began the slow, heavy ascent back to the surface. They emerged into a world that was often unrecognizable. The air would be thick with the smell of burning timber and pulverized plaster. The streets they had walked down just hours before were sometimes completely gone, replaced by deep, jagged craters and piles of smoking ruin. It was a devastating, terrifying sight. But the enemy, watching from afar, waiting for the white flags of surrender to rise from the ashes, was met with a bewildering, quiet defiance. Evelyn walked holding her daughter's hands, stepping carefully over a shattered street lamp. She stopped in front of her local bakery. The entire front wall of the building had been torn away in the night, exposing the ovens and the flour bins to the cool morning air. But there, standing amidst the rubble, covered in a fine layer of white flour and gray ash, was the baker. He was calmly sweeping the debris away from his counter. He had taken a piece of chalk and written a message on a salvaged piece of blackboard, propping it up against a broken brick. It read, "More open than usual today." Evelyn smiled, a deep, genuine warmth blooming in her chest, and stepped forward to buy her morning loaf. Down the street, the milkman was carefully guiding his horse and cart around the craters, leaving glass bottles of white milk on the front steps of houses that no longer had roofs. The postman was stepping over fallen beams to deliver letters to doors that opened into empty space. The machine had done its absolute worst. It had unleashed a firestorm of unimaginable proportions, designed to paralyze the mind and break the heart. But it had completely failed to understand the quiet, everyday heroism of a people who simply refused to stop living. The success of the early years of the war had been built on the illusion of invincibility and the weaponization of terror. But here, amidst the broken stones of the island nation, the terror had lost its teeth. The people had looked into the abyss, and they had found that it was not as deep as their own courage. They had learned that the warmth of a shared blanket is stronger than the cold logic of an engine. They had learned that a soft psalm in the dark can drown out the roar of a falling sky. And they had learned that while the giant could break the buildings above, it could never, ever reach the lanterns burning quietly, stubbornly, beautifully beneath the pavement. The wind weaving through the mountain pass carried a chill that had nothing to do with the lingering winter snow. To live in the ancient, folding valleys of the Balkans is to live in a place where the earth itself feels alive, steeped in the deep, echoing memories of 1,000 years. Here, the mountains rise like great, jagged crowns of pale stone against the sky, standing guard over deep gorges where rivers run the color of crushed emeralds. It is a rugged, breathtaking landscape that has always demanded a quiet, enduring strength from the people who call it home. They built their houses from the very bones of the mountains, thick stone walls designed to keep out the bitter winds and the heavy snows. They measured time not by the ticking of clocks, but by the slow, familiar turning of the seasons, the blossoming of the plum trees, and the rhythmic, hollow clanking of the sheep bells echoing up the terraced slopes. For centuries, these mountains had been a fortress. They had seen empires rise in the distant lowlands and crash against their foothills like waves against a seawall, only to recede back into the tide of history. The people of the valleys believed, with a quiet, fierce pride, that their high, hidden world was simply too steep, too wild, and too proud to ever be entirely swallowed by the loud ambitions of the world below. But the new storm that was gathering on the horizon was unlike any the mountains had ever faced. It did not need to climb the treacherous, winding paths to secure a victory. It had learned how to conquer from afar. To understand the tragic, overwhelming success of this moment, we must look at the terrible, silent weapon of diplomatic intimidation. The giant did not always need to strike with an iron fist. Sometimes, it only needed to cast a shadow so large and so dark that the nations standing in its path simply felt the warmth leave the sun. In a small, stone cottage clinging to the side of a steep valley, a young woman named Elena sat by the hearth. The fire had died down to a bed of glowing, ruby coals, casting a soft, flickering light across the heavy, woven rugs on the floor. Elena was a weaver, her fingers scarred and nimble from years of working the heavy wooden loom that sat in the corner of the room. She was holding a letter she had written to her sister, who lived in a village just across the winding river, a river that had always served as the border between their two countries. But the crackling voices on the small, wooden radio sitting on the mantel had just delivered a message that made the world feel entirely upside down. Far away, in grand, opulent rooms filled with polished tables and velvet drapes, men who had never smelled the mountain pines or felt the biting cold of the valley had signed pieces of paper. Through a terrifying blend of veiled threats, broken promises, and the sheer, overwhelming pressure of the marching armies surrounding them, the borders of the peninsula had been erased and redrawn with the stroke of a fountain pen. Elena looked at the envelope in her lap. How was it possible, she wondered, that her sister, who lived close enough to hear the church bells ring across the gorge, was suddenly living in a captive land, while Elena's own village was now aligned with the encroaching shadow? The mountains had not moved. The river had not changed its course. But the world had shifted beneath their feet without a single shot being fired. This was the profound, psychological violence of the early years. The enemy succeeded by making the old maps feel entirely meaningless. They used the sheer scale of their reputation, the terrifying stories of their unyielding speed, to paralyze the governments of the ancient valleys. They forced leaders to hand over the keys to their kingdoms simply by standing at the gate and whispering about the fire they could unleash. It was a bloodless capitulation, but it left a wound in the heart of the people that was deep and aching. Yet, the paper promises of diplomats are rarely enough to satisfy a machine built for consumption. Within days of the shifting borders, the true, physical weight of the intimidation finally poured into the valleys. High on a grassy ridge, where the air was thin and sweet, an old shepherd named Goran stood leaning on his carved wooden staff. He had a face like weathered oak, lined with a lifetime of squinting into the sun and the wind. He knew every hidden cave, every safe crossing of the river, and every mood of the sky. His flock of sheep grazed peacefully behind him, completely unaware of the shadow falling over the earth. Goran looked down into the main valley, a deep, sweeping corridor that had been a trade route since the days of the ancients. What he saw made his heavy, calloused hands tighten around his staff. A great, gray river was flowing through the gorge. But it was not made of water. It was an endless, churning column of armored vehicles, transport trucks, and marching men. They moved with that same, terrifying, mechanical rhythm that had broken the north and the west. The narrow valley walls, which had always amplified the sounds of the rushing river and the singing birds, now trapped and magnified the deep, throaty roar of 1,000 engines. The sound was absolute. It was a physical pressure that pushed against the eardrums and rattled the stones beneath Goran's feet. The old shepherd did not move. He simply stood on the high ridge, a solitary, timeless figure watching the terrifying, coordinated speed of the new century invade his ancient home. He felt the overwhelming nature of the display. They were moving so fast, with such an abundance of dark iron and loud machinery, that any thought of standing in their way felt like trying to stop an avalanche with an open hand. This was how the Balkans were swallowed whole. It was a combination of political suffocation and the sudden, shocking arrival of an unstoppable physical force. The swift violence was not always found in the heat of a drawn-out battle. It was found in the sheer, paralyzing awe of seeing a peaceful, isolated valley transformed into a highway of war overnight. When the metal columns finally rolled into the small, cobblestone squares of the mountain villages, the air grew thick with a tense, heavy silence. In Elena's village, the townsfolk gathered around the old stone well in the center of the square. They did not raise their voices. They did not hold up weapons. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces pale and drawn, watching as the foreign soldiers climbed down from their dusty, rumbling machines. The conquerors walked with the casual, heavy arrogance of men who know they are feared. They looked at the modest stone houses, the simple clothing of the villagers, and the ancient, moss-covered church, and they saw only a quiet, backwards place that had wisely chosen not to fight. They believed their intimidation was complete. But as Elena stood near the front of the crowd, her hands tucked deep into the pockets of her woven apron, she felt a different kind of quiet settling over her neighbors. It was not the quiet of a broken spirit. It was the quiet of a deep, ancient stone that refuses to be moved. A young, foreign soldier, his uniform covered in the pale dust of the mountain roads, approached the well. He looked exhausted, his face streaked with sweat and grime. He held out an empty metal canteen toward the crowd, barking a command in a language no one understood. But the gesture was clear. He was demanding water. For a long, suspended moment, no one moved. The air between the villagers and the occupier crackled with unspoken tension. The weight of the giant was pressing down on the square, demanding submission. Then, slowly, Elena stepped forward. She did not lower her eyes. She did not tremble. She reached out with her scarred, gentle hands and took the metal canteen from the boy. She turned to the well, lowered the heavy wooden bucket into the cool, dark earth, and drew it up, hand over hand. The sound of the splashing water was the only noise in the square. She poured the clear, freezing water into his canteen until it overflowed, spilling over his dusty boots. Then, she handed it back to him. She did not do it out of fear. She did not do it because she recognized his authority. She did it because in the high mountains, you do not deny a thirsty traveler a drink from the well, no matter what dark flag they carry. It was an act of profound, quiet defiance. She was telling him, without a single word, that while his machines might occupy the square, they could not change the fundamental decency of the people who lived there. They could not dictate the hospitality of the mountains. The young soldier took the canteen, looking into Elena's steady, unblinking eyes. He hesitated, the arrogance slipping from his face for just a fraction of a second, replaced by a flicker of uncomfortable realization. He drank, wiped his mouth, and turned away, retreating back to the safety of his iron machine. The intimidation had swallowed the map, but it had entirely failed to swallow the soul of the village. As the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks, painting the sky in deep, bruised shades of indigo and violet, the foreign columns finally powered down their engines. The sudden absence of the mechanical roar left a ringing emptiness in the valley. The villagers slowly dispersed, returning to their stone cottages. They closed their heavy wooden doors and drew their curtains tight. The shadows of the occupying army stretched long and dark across the cobblestones, claiming the physical space of the old world. But high above, on the grassy ridge, Goran the shepherd was lighting a small fire. The tiny, golden flame flickered against the vast, encroaching dark. Down in the valley, through the cracks in the wooden shutters, other small lights began to bloom. Elena sat by her hearth, staring into the glowing coals, holding the letter she would find a way to send to her sister, no matter where the imaginary lines were drawn. The enemy had been overwhelmingly successful. They had used the fear of their own momentum to erase the borders and silence the valleys. They believed they had conquered the mountains. But as the night deepened, and the ancient stars emerged bright and cold over the peaks, the truth of the Balkans remained hidden in the quiet homes. You can force a signature on a piece of paper. You can fill a gorge with a river of steel. You can intimidate a government into silence. But you cannot break the deep, enduring roots of a people who know how to survive the longest, coldest winters. The valleys had been swallowed, but the echoes of the old world were still bouncing off the high, pale stones, whispering a promise of resilience into the dark. And in the quiet warmth of their homes, the mountain people simply wrapped their shawls tighter, tended to their fires, and prepared to outlast the storm. The sand held no memory of the marching boots, for the desert only ever listens to the wind. The armies that had swept across the soft, green valleys of Europe, moving with the terrifying speed of a modern storm, finally found themselves standing at the edge of an entirely different world. They had crossed the warm, blue waters of the sea, bringing their heavy iron, their grand ambitions, and their roaring engines to a landscape that had remained unchanged since the dawn of time. This was not a place of cobblestone streets, sheltering forests, or winding, familiar rivers. It was an endless, rolling ocean of pale gold, burnt ochre, and blinding white light. It was a place where the earth met the sky in a perfectly flat, unbroken line, creating a horizon so distant and so vast it made the human eye ache just to look at it. To the leaders standing in their grand, wood-paneled rooms thousands of miles away, this seemingly empty space was simply another map to be conquered. They drew long, sweeping arrows across the paper, moving tiny pins over territories that looked small and manageable from the quiet comfort of a velvet chair. They broadcasted their voices through the radios, telling the listening world that this was another grand victory, another inevitable, effortless step for an unstoppable empire. But a paper map cannot capture the suffocating, physical weight of the midday sun. A map cannot show you the truth of the dust. The reality of this strange, quiet campaign was not a glorious continuation of the unbroken steppe. It was a silent, agonizing overextension. It was a mechanical giant reaching its heavy arm too far out into the void, stepping away from its supply lines, its cool forests, and its familiar roads, to chase a victory that shimmered and danced on the horizon like a trick of the light. In the long, bruised shadow of a stalled transport machine, a young mechanic named Julian sat cross-legged in the deep, shifting sand. He was a boy born in a lush, mountainous village, a place of deep, cool lakes and thick, fragrant pine needles. Now, his face was burned by the wind, and his hands, usually so skilled at coaxing life into complicated gears, were blistered and coated in a pale, inescapable grit. The dust of the desert was not like the dirt of the continent. It was as fine as talcum powder, rising in massive, choking clouds that hung in the still air for hours. It found its way into everything. It coated the food, it clouded the drinking water, and most devastatingly, it worked its way deeply into the sealed heart of the invincible machines. The great engines, built to conquer the modern world, were being ground to a sudden, coughing halt by tiny, ancient grains of sand. Julian leaned his heavy head against the hot metal tire, closing his eyes, desperately trying to remember the feeling of wet grass against his bare feet. He was so incredibly tired. The sheer, overwhelming effort required simply to exist in this environment was draining the life from the army. They were not just fighting an enemy, they were fighting the earth itself, and the earth was completely indifferent to their flags. When the sun reached its zenith, the desert became a furnace, and the world began to bend. Looking out across the plains, the soldiers saw the true deception of the shifting sands. The heat rising from the earth warped the light, creating shimmering, watery mirages. Tired, desperate men, their canteens long empty, would stare into the distance and see cool, rippling lakes fringed with green palm trees. They would see the shapes of cities that did not exist. It was a profound psychological torture, moving forward day after day, constantly reaching for a horizon that constantly retreated. It felt as though they were walking on a treadmill made of fire. The victories they were told they were winning felt exactly like those mirages, beautiful and promising from a distance, but dissolving into nothing but dry, burning air the moment they tried to hold them in their hands. Somewhere across the vast, invisible line that separated the armies, another young man sat in a shallow trench scooped from the face of a dune. His name was Arthur, a soldier from a damp, rainy town on a green island far away. He wore shorts and a wool shirt bleached nearly white by the sun. He was not thinking about the grand strategies of the war. He was focused entirely on a tiny, precious ritual. Using a handful of dried scrub brush he had spent an hour collecting, he coaxed a small, fragile flame to life. He balanced a blackened tin cup over the fire, watching the precious ration of water slowly begin to boil. Arthur reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled paper packet containing a pinch of tea leaves. It was a tiny luxury, a delicate thread connecting him to the life he had left behind. When the water bubbled, he sprinkled the leaves into the tin, leaning forward to breathe in the familiar, comforting aroma. Another soldier, a boy with sun-blistered cheeks and a tired smile, slid down the side of the dune and sat beside him. Arthur did not say a word, he simply poured half of the warm, amber liquid into his friend's empty cup. They sat together in the profound, heavy silence of the desert afternoon, sipping their tea, sharing a quiet moment of absolute humanity in a landscape devoid of life. They did not speak of the machines or the marching. They spoke of the rain. They spoke of the smell of wet pavement and the sound of rivers moving over smooth stones. As the long, brutal day finally began to surrender, the desert underwent a breathtaking, violent transformation. The sun did not simply set, it bled across the sky. The heavens were painted in deep, bruised shades of violet, burning orange, and rich magenta, casting long, dramatic shadows across the crests of the dunes. And then, the heat of the day vanished, instantly replaced by a bitter, bone-aching cold. The sand surrendered its warmth to the dark, and the soldiers wrapped themselves tightly in their heavy wool coats, shivering against the sudden chill. But with the dark came the true master of the desert. The stars. Without the soft, orange glow of city lights to dilute the sky, the night became an overwhelming canopy of diamonds. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a heavy, glowing river of pale light. The stars were so bright, so numerous, and so painfully clear that they seemed to press down against the earth. Julian lay on his back in the sand, his coat pulled up to his chin, looking up into the infinite vault. For the first time since he had put on his uniform, the grand, terrifying illusion of the Empire entirely fell away. Beneath the unblinking gaze of a billion ancient suns, the war suddenly felt incredibly, heartbreakingly small. The giant machines, the roaring tanks, the grand speeches of the leaders, they were nothing but tiny, insignificant specks of dust swirling in the dark. The soldiers on both sides of the dunes felt the exact same, profound sense of smallness. They were just boys, terribly lost, shivering in the cold, caught in a struggle that spanned continents but amounted to less than a whisper in the face of the universe. By the faint, shielded light of a small lantern, Julian unbuttoned his breast pocket and pulled out a small, sand-gridded notebook. His fingers were stiff with the cold as he held a pencil to the paper. "Dearest Mother," he wrote, the graphite leaving faint, gray marks on the page. "The quiet here is heavier than the noise of the city. We drive for days, and the world never changes. I think the war has gotten too big for us. We are stretched so thin, like a drop of paint spread across an ocean. The generals say we are winning, but when I look around, all I see is empty space. I look up at the sky at night, and it is so vast it makes my chest ache. I hope the stars look smaller from your kitchen window. I hope the dog is keeping your feet warm. I am tired, Mother. The sand is winning." He closed the small book, tucking it back over his heart, a fragile shield against the freezing night. This was the quiet, hidden truth of the campaign in the shifting sands. The terrifying momentum of the early years was exhausting itself. The conquerors were learning the bitter lesson that you cannot intimidate the desert, and you cannot outrun the sheer scale of the earth. The illusion of an easy, sweeping victory was dissolving, revealing the terrifying, endless reality of a war that had grown far beyond the control of the men who had started it. Yet, in the midst of this overwhelming vastness, the human spirit continued to flicker, small but incredibly stubborn. Across the silent, freezing dunes, thousands of boys like Julian and Arthur lay beneath the same immense sky. They were enemies by circumstance, divided by flags and orders, but in the dark, they were perfectly united by their shared endurance. They shivered against the same cold wind. They closed their eyes and dreamed of the exact same rain. They held on to the memory of their mothers, their sisters, and their quiet homes, keeping the small, warm embers of their humanity alive against the cold, indifferent dark. The giant was overextended, lost in a sea of sand, chasing mirages toward an impossible horizon. But the boys sleeping in the dust simply pulled their coats tighter, listened to the whispering wind, and waited for the slow, inevitable turning of the earth to bring them the morning. The wind moving through the tall grass sounded like a deep, ancient breath, whispering secrets to a sky that was far too wide. It was the very edge of summer, a time when the days stretch out long and golden, and the twilight lingers on the horizon like a soft, bruised memory of the sun. On the eastern edge of the continent, where the neat, cultivated fields of the west give way to the vast, rolling ocean of the steppe, the earth was holding a profound, heavy silence. If you were to stand on a gentle rise and look out across that endless sea of green and silver grass, you would not see a wall. You would not see a fortress of stone or a deep, rushing river designed to keep the world at bay. You would only see space. An impossible, staggering amount of space, unfolding all the way to the curve of the earth, resting peacefully beneath a canopy of indifferent stars. But tucked into the folds of this quiet landscape, hidden beneath the shadow of the scattered birch groves and resting in the shallow depressions of the dry earth, a massive, mechanical giant was holding its breath, waiting for the dawn. To understand the tragedy of this warm summer night, we must look into the hearts of the men who sat waiting in the dark. We must look at the terrible, intoxicating poison of ultimate hubris. For months, the grand, unstoppable machine had rolled across the map, folding horizons and shattering the old world. They had swallowed the deep forests, marched through the grand, silent cities, and stood victorious on the edges of the sea. The men who wore the dark uniforms had been told a story, over and over again, until it became the very air they breathed. They were told that they were a force of nature. They were told that their engines would never fail, that their boots would never tire, and that the world would simply continue to part before them like tall grass parting for the wind. And so, as millions of young men camped on the edge of the great eastern expanse, they did not feel the heavy, cold dread of a prolonged war. They felt the restless, naive anticipation of boys waiting for a final, glorious summer holiday to begin. In a small clearing surrounded by the slender, white trunks of birch trees, a young soldier named Johannes sat on an overturned wooden crate. The camp around him was a low hum of quiet activity. Harnesses clinking, the soft nickering of horses, the faint smell of engine oil mingling with the sweet scent of crushed clover. Johannes had a lantern resting by his boots, its flame turned down low to a gentle, golden flicker. Resting on his knee was a pad of paper. He was a boy from a crowded, bustling city with narrow streets and tall brick chimneys, a boy entirely unaccustomed to the terrifying emptiness of the open plains. But tonight, his face was relaxed. His eyes held a weary but absolute certainty. He touched the tip of his pencil to his tongue and began to write to his mother. Dearest Mama, his handwriting was looping and rushed, carrying the restless energy of youth. The air is so warm tonight. They tell us that tomorrow, we finally step forward into the east. Do not worry for me. The officers are smiling, and the sergeants say this will be the easiest walk of all. They say the house is rotten, and we only need to kick the door for the whole thing to come crashing down. I have packed the warm socks you knitted for me, but I am certain I will not need them. The sun is shining on us, Mama. I will bring you a beautiful shawl from the capital, and I will be home before the leaves begin to turn brown and fall from the oak tree in our yard. He folded the letter, sealing it with a drop of wax, entirely convinced of the truth of his own words. This was the quiet, devastating success of the early years turning inward. The empire had become a victim of its own magnificent illusion. They had mistaken the fragile, temporary victories of the spring for an eternal, unshakable destiny. They looked at the vast, sprawling map of the East and saw only a blank space waiting to be colored in. They did not see the sheer, crushing distance. They did not see the millions of quiet, resilient souls who called that vastness home. They only saw one last, quick victory. One final push, and then the world would finally be quiet, and they could all go home. A few yards away from Johannes, leaning against the thick tire of a transport truck, an older corporal named Elias was slowly packing tobacco into a wooden pipe. Elias was a quiet man, a veteran of the long, muddy years of the previous war. He did not share the bright, fragile optimism of the boys around him. He struck a match, the sudden flare illuminating the deep, tired lines etched around his eyes. He puffed gently, letting the sweet smoke drift up into the branches of the birch trees. Then, he looked out past the edge of the camp, out into the dark, whispering steppe. Elias felt a cold, unsettling knot pulling tight in the center of his chest. It was an instinct, a quiet, primitive warning buried deep in his bones. He looked at the endless, flat horizon. It was too quiet. It was too big. The landscape did not feel like a defeated enemy waiting to surrender. It felt like a massive, patient creature, sleeping with its mouth wide open, simply waiting for them to walk inside. He watched Johannes fold his letter, seeing the boy's hopeful, innocent smile in the lantern light. Elias felt a profound, heavy sorrow wash over him. He knew that the boys believed the stories. They believed the summer would last forever. But Elias knew that no machine, no matter how grand or terrible, could conquer the sheer, overwhelming geometry of the earth. He walked slowly over to the young soldier, his boots making a soft crunching sound in the dry grass. He did not speak of his fears. He did not want to steal the boy's hope, for hope is sometimes the only warmth a soldier has left. A letter for home, Johannes? Elias asked softly, his voice a low, comforting rumble in the dark. Johannes looked up, smiling, and nodded. Yes, Corporal. Telling my mother to keep the dust off my good shoes. We'll be marching in the victory parade by September. Elias offered a small, gentle smile, a smile that did not quite reach his tired eyes. He reached into his deep coat pocket and pulled out a small, foil-wrapped piece of hard chocolate, a rare and precious luxury. He pressed it into the young boy's hand. Save it for tomorrow, Elias whispered gently. A little sugar for the road. The dust can be very dry out there. Johannes thanked him, his eyes wide with genuine gratitude, tucking the small silver square into his breast pocket, right next to his heart and his letter. It was a tiny, quiet moment of everyday kindness, a brief shelter of shared humanity standing on the very edge of the abyss. As the short summer night deepened, the vast camp slowly settled into a heavy, dreamless sleep. The lanterns were extinguished one by one, leaving only the soft, silver light of the stars to illuminate the sea of green uniforms and gray metal. Millions of men lay curled in the grass, resting their heads on their canvas packs, breathing in the warm, fragrant air. They were caught in a beautiful, tragic slumber, entirely consumed by the ultimate hubris of their age. They dreamed of quick marches and cheering crowds. They dreamed of autumn harvests in their hometowns, of warm hearths and the soft embrace of their families. They were perfectly, absolutely certain that the machine they rode upon was invincible. But out in the dark, beyond the sleeping boys and the silent engines, the steppe continued to whisper. The tall grass swayed in the invisible current of the wind, singing a slow, ancient song that had echoed across the plains since before the dawn of memory. It was a song of infinite patience. The earth knew that empires are fragile things, built of loud noises and brief, shining moments of arrogance. The earth knew that metal rusts, that boots wear through, and that even the brightest summer must eventually surrender to the freezing, absolute dark of the winter. The quiet vastness of the East was not empty. It was filled with distance, with time, and with a quiet, enduring resilience that the sleeping conquerors could not even begin to fathom. As the first, faint bruise of purple light began to touch the eastern horizon, signaling the final dawn of the old world, Johannes stirred in his sleep, pulling his wool blanket a little tighter against his shoulders. In his pocket, the letter to his mother rested against his chest, holding a promise of autumn that would never be kept. The giant was about to wake. The engines would soon roar to life, and the ultimate illusion would carry them forward into the vast, waiting unknown. But for just a few moments longer, the world remained peacefully, tragically quiet, wrapped in the soft, unending whispers of the grass. The wheat was so heavy with the golden promise of summer that it seemed to hold the warmth of the sun long after the evening stars had appeared. At the very edge of the vast, rolling east, the world was caught in the gentle embrace of the shortest nights of the year. It was a time when the twilight barely faded before the dawn began to paint the horizon in soft shades of pearl and lilac. The land here was an endless ocean of green and gold, a fertile expanse that breathed with the slow, steady rhythm of the seasons. For generations, the people who lived upon this soil had measured their lives not by the loud, frantic ticking of clocks, but by the quiet turning of the earth, the falling of the rain, and the sacred, timeless ritual of the harvest. To look out across the frontier on this warm, fragrant night was to look upon a landscape entirely at peace. It was a peace built on the comforting illusion of distance, and on the paper promises signed in distant cities. The people of the steppe believed that their world was simply too large, too deep, and too abundant to be easily swallowed by the mechanical storm that had consumed the West. But the terrible success of the advancing giant was always rooted in its ability to shatter the morning. It succeeded because it knew how to weaponize the impossible, using the sheer, breathtaking scale of its surprise to paralyze the heart before a single hand could be raised in defense. In a small, wooden sentry box nestled along the damp, grassy banks of a winding frontier river, a young guard named Ilya sat listening to the gentle lapping of the water. The night air was incredibly sweet, carrying the scent of blooming clover and damp earth. Ilya was barely 20 years old, a boy from a quiet village hundreds of miles away, where he had learned to sing before he had learned to read. His uniform felt heavy and unnecessary in the warm summer air. He rested his chin in his hand, watching the slow dance of the fireflies over the dark, glassy surface of the river. A small tin cup of tea, long gone cold, sat on the wooden bench beside him. In his lap rested a crumpled piece of paper. He had spent the last hour trying to find the perfect words to write to his sweetheart, Marina, who was waiting for him back home. My dearest, his pencil had scratched softly in the dim light of a hooded lantern. The river is so quiet tonight. I watched a heron wade into the shallows just after sunset, moving so slowly it hardly made a ripple. The older men talk of shadows gathering across the water, but I look out and see only the trees sleeping in the mist. I think the world is too beautiful right now for anyone to want to break it. I have saved a small portion of my sugar ration for you, and I keep it wrapped in wax paper in my coat. I will bring it to you when the autumn comes. Ilya folded the letter, a soft, wistful smile touching his lips. He leaned his head back against the wooden planks of the sentry box, closing his eyes, letting the hypnotic, rhythmic song of the crickets lull him into a state of deep, peaceful rest. He did not know that he was living in the very last moments of the old world. Miles away from the river, deep within the heart of the Golden Plains, the farming villages were also wrapped in a heavy, dreamless slumber. The wheat fields surrounding them stood tall and proud, a magnificent tapestry of life that had been coaxed from the soil through months of backbreaking, loving labor. In a small, whitewashed cottage with a thatched roof, an older woman named Oksana was already awake, moving quietly in the dark so as not to disturb her sleeping grandchildren. She tied a linen apron around her waist and walked out into the cool, pre-dawn air. She stepped onto the soft dirt of the pathway that led into her family's fields. Oksana reached out a weathered, calloused hand, gently brushing her fingertips against the heavy, bearded heads of the wheat. They were damp with dew, and they felt full and rich beneath her touch. Tomorrow, the whole village would gather with their scythes, and the great harvest would begin. It was a time of quiet joy, a time when the earth finally surrendered its bounty to keep the people warm and fed through the long, freezing winter that would eventually arrive. Oksana breathed in the smell of the grain, a smell that meant survival, family, and home. But as she stood there, perfectly still in the silver light of the fading moon, Oksana felt a strange sensation beneath her bare feet. It was a tremor, faint at first, like the beating of a heart deep underground. She frowned, looking down at the soil. The earth was vibrating. Back at the river, young Ilya opened his eyes. The song of the crickets had suddenly, entirely ceased. A profound, unnatural silence had fallen over the water, the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that precedes a terrible storm. He stood up, stepping out of the wooden box, his hand resting nervously on the leather strap of his rifle. He looked across the river, toward the western bank, which was still shrouded in the deep shadows of the lingering night. And then, the horizon began to glow. It was not the soft, golden light of the morning sun. It was a jagged, angry red that tore through the mist, a terrifying, artificial dawn that seemed to set the very clouds on fire. Before Ilya's mind could even begin to process the light, the sound arrived. It was a deep, apocalyptic roar, a mechanical thunder that rolled across the water and struck him with the physical force of a heavy wind. This was the devastating weapon of massive surprise. It did not merely announce a battle, it entirely overwhelmed the senses. It flooded the eyes with fire and the ears with iron, leaving the young boys on the frontier standing in a state of absolute, heartbreaking paralysis. Ilya did not raise his weapon. He simply stood on the grassy bank, clutching the pocket where his letter to Marina lay hidden, watching as the shadows across the river suddenly took on the shape of 1,000 roaring beasts. The giant had not stopped. The illusion of distance had been a lie. As the sun finally began to crest the eastern horizon, attempting to bring the true morning to the world, it illuminated a tragedy of unimaginable scale. The mechanical tide poured across the borders, ignoring the paper treaties and the quiet hopes of the world. They moved with that same, terrifying coordination, a synchronized ballet of dark metal and crushing treads. But the most profound heartbreak of that morning was not found in the collapse of the military lines. It was found in the wheat fields. Oksana stood frozen at the edge of her farm, her hands covering her mouth, as the first of the massive, gray machines crested the gentle hill overlooking her village. They did not stay on the dirt roads. They did not respect the boundaries of the farms. They simply rolled forward, a relentless, unfeeling wall of iron, driving straight into the heart of the golden harvest. The sound of the treads crushing the tall, ripe wheat was a sickening, dry crackle that seemed to echo in Oksana's very soul. The beautiful, rolling ocean of grain, the lifeblood of her family, was effortlessly flattened into the dirt, ground down into the mud by the weight of a war that had nothing to do with the soil. Behind the machines, the earth caught fire. The dry summer air fed the flames, and soon, a thick, choking cloud of gray smoke began to drift across the sun. The ash began to fall. It drifted down like a terrible, dark snow, coating the white walls of Oksana's cottage, settling gently onto the leaves of the apple trees, and dusting the shoulders of the terrified villagers who had run out into the streets. It was a harvest of ash, a cruel, immediate reversal of all the love and labor they had poured into the earth. The success of the conqueror on this terrible morning was absolute. They had stolen the sunrise. They had taken a people who were preparing to gather bread, and forced them instead to gather their children and run into the dark woods. The psychological shock was paralyzing. When your world is suddenly, violently transformed from a quiet field of gold into a roaring furnace of iron, the mind cannot find a place to rest. You can only watch in quiet, devastating sorrow as the life you knew is simply erased. Yet, even in the very center of this overwhelming despair, the quiet, stubborn light of the human spirit refused to be completely extinguished. As the dark machines rolled past her cottage, filling the air with the bitter smell of burning diesel and scorched earth, Oksana did not collapse. Her heart was breaking, tearing at the seams as she watched her fields burn, but she knew that survival requires a different kind of strength. It is not the strength of iron, but the strength of the willow tree, which bends entirely to the ground in a hurricane so that it does not snap. She turned away from the burning horizon and rushed back into her small home. She did not try to save the heavy furniture or the delicate porcelain plates she had inherited from her mother. She went straight to the wooden bin in the kitchen and scooped a large handful of raw, unground wheat grains into the deep pocket of her apron. It was a small, almost invisible act of profound heroism. She was saving the seed. She was holding on to the quiet, unshakable promise that no matter how terrible the fire, the earth would eventually cool. The machines would eventually rust and stop. And when they did, the people would need to plant again. She gathered her trembling grandchildren, wrapping them in thick wool shawls to protect them from the falling ash. She took their small, warm hands in her own, offering them a soft, reassuring squeeze that hid the terror trembling in her own bones. Together, they walked out of the back door, slipping away from the village and moving quietly into the deep, sheltering shadows of the birch forest. Back at the river, young Ilya was also walking. His sentry box had been shattered, his quiet world swallowed by the roaring tide. He was lost, separated from his friends, wandering through the thick brush as the sky above him turned entirely gray with smoke. He was terrified, his heart beating like a frantic bird against his ribs. But as he walked, he reached into his coat and felt the small, wax-wrapped package of sugar and the folded letter he had written in the peace of the night. They were his anchor. They were the tangible proof that a beautiful, quiet world had existed just a few hours ago, and they were a silent vow that he would do whatever it took to see that world again. The dawn had brought fire, and the morning had brought a terrible, crushing sorrow to the golden plains. The giant had struck with a massive, terrifying surprise, believing that by burning the fields, it could burn the spirit of the people who tended them. But as Oksana led her grandchildren through the quiet woods, carrying the seeds of the future in her apron, and as Ilya walked through the smoke holding onto a letter of love, they proved that the conqueror had made a fatal miscalculation. You can crush the wheat. You can burn the stalks and turn the harvest to ash. But you cannot destroy the deep, enduring love that a farmer has for the earth. You cannot erase the quiet, stubborn resilience of a people who know that after the longest, darkest winters, the green shoots always, eventually, break through the soil again. The long, bitter struggle of the East had just begun, and the world was now entirely engulfed in the shadow. But beneath the falling ash, in the quietest corners of the broken morning, the fragile, beautiful seeds of survival were already being planted in the dark. The dust of the Eastern Road did not rise into the air. It clung to the heavy boots of the marching men like the inescapable weight of time itself. It was late in the summer, a season that had begun with bright, fragile promises of a swift and glorious end. The great, mechanical beast had broken through the borders, pushing its way into the vast, open plains with that same terrifying, coordinated speed the world had come to fear. From the grand offices far away, the reports were a continuous, triumphant chorus. The lines on the map were moving ever eastward. The enemy was retreating. The victory, they said, was already written in the stars. But a map is a small, neat thing, easily folded and tucked into a warm coat pocket. A map cannot tell you how it feels when the earth simply refuses to end. To understand the hidden cracks that begin to form inside the seemingly invincible machine, we must step away from the grand strategies and walk down into the thick, choking dust of the country roads. We must look at the faces of the young men who were doing the walking. The rhythm of the march had fundamentally changed. In the springtime, in the neat, paved streets of the western cities, their boots had struck the cobblestones in a sharp, crisp unison. Click, clack. Click, clack. It was a sound of absolute, mechanical confidence. But here, in the endless, rolling ocean of the steppe, the rhythm had dissolved into a slow, dragging shuffle. The fine, powdery earth swallowed the sound of their footsteps, turning the invincible march into a weary, hypnotic trudge. They were winning, but the victory felt entirely hollow. In the middle of a long, serpentine column of tired men, a young soldier named Lucas walked with his head bowed, his eyes fixed entirely on the worn leather of the boots belonging to the man in front of him. Lucas was a baker's son from a small, walled town where the church bells rang every hour and the horizon was comfortably hidden by gentle, green hills. Now, he was adrift in an ocean of space. For weeks, they had marched from sunrise to sunset. They would capture a small, wooden village, sleep for a few hours in the dry grass, and wake up to march again. But no matter how far they walked, the landscape never seemed to change. The flat, golden plain stretched out in every direction, an infinite loop of sun, grass, and dust. Lucas felt a profound, quiet dread settling into the marrow of his bones. He reached into his tunic, his fingers brushing against a folded piece of paper. Whenever the column halted for a few precious minutes, he would take out his stub of a pencil and add a few lines to a letter he was writing to his older sister. Dearest Clara, his handwriting, usually so neat, was slanted and unsteady from the trembling of his exhausted hands. The map has lied to us. They told us we were crossing a country, but it feels as though we have marched right off the edge of the world. We walk for days, we conquer the earth beneath our feet, but when we look up, the horizon has not moved a single inch. It is always just as far away. The sky here is too big. It presses down on us, making us feel like tiny insects crawling across a massive, empty table. My legs ache with a heaviness I cannot describe. We are winning every day, Clara, but I have never felt so entirely defeated. This was the terrifying psychological toll of the vast land. The machine had been designed to overwhelm an enemy with speed, but how do you outrun infinity? How do you conquer a space that simply swallows your momentum and asks for more? The cracks in the armor were not just in the minds of the boys, they were in the iron itself. The mighty engines that had terrified the world were beginning to cough and wheeze. The incredibly fine dust of the steppe, a powder older than any empire, found its way into the delicate gears, the filters, and the carburetors. The pristine, dark vehicles that had rolled so proudly through the capitals of Europe were now plastered in a thick layer of pale grit, their hoods propped open, venting steam into the blistering afternoon air. Beside one of these stalled machines, a young driver named Thomas sat on the running board, his face buried in his hands. He was covered in black grease and white dust. He had spent hours trying to coax the engine back to life, his knuckles bleeding from slipping wrenches. He was not an angry conqueror, he was just a tired boy who wanted to wash his hands in a cool stream. A large, gentle draft horse, requisitioned from a farm weeks ago to help pull the heavy artillery, stood tied to the back of the broken truck. The animal's head hung low, its flanks heaving with slow, exhausted breaths. Thomas looked up at the horse. He saw the same profound weariness in its large, dark eyes that he felt in his own soul. With a slow, aching movement, Thomas unscrewed the cap of his metal canteen. He had only a few swallows of warm, metallic-tasting water left. He did not drink it. Instead, he stood up, walked over to the horse, and gently poured the water into the palm of his hand, holding it up to the animal's velvet muzzle. The horse lapped the water eagerly, its rough tongue scraping gently against Thomas's skin. The boy rested his forehead against the animal's warm neck, closing his eyes. It was a beautiful, heartbreaking moment of shared suffering. In the middle of the grand, terrible march of history, a boy and a horse simply comforted each other, two innocent creatures dragged far from home, united by the heavy, crushing weight of the journey. Nature was offering no resistance, and yet it was winning. The land did not need to fight them, it only needed to let them walk until their boots wore through and their spirits ran dry. As the column slowly moved past a small, quiet village, the true nature of their success became clear to anyone who cared to look. The villagers stood by their wooden fences, watching the great army pass. They had been told to fear these men, to hide from the mechanical monsters that had swallowed the earth. An old man, leaning heavily on a carved walking stick, stood under the shade of a wide oak tree. He watched the soldiers shuffle past, dragging their rifles, their uniforms stained with salt and dust, their eyes hollow and staring blankly ahead. The old man did not see a master race. He did not see invincible titans. He saw a parade of ghosts. He saw a boy, no older than his own grandson, stumble over a deep rut in the dirt road. The boy fell hard to his knees, his helmet slipping down over his eyes. For a long, suspended moment, the boy simply stayed there in the dust, too exhausted to push himself back up. The old man felt a sudden, unexpected pang of pity. He knew this land. He knew its beautiful, merciless scale. He knew that the steppe did not care about uniforms or flags. It only cared about endurance. Without thinking of the danger, the old man stepped away from his fence, walked slowly into the road, and reached out a withered, trembling hand. He gripped the young soldier by the elbow and gently helped him back to his feet. The boy looked at the old man, his face a mask of pale dust and silent sorrow. He did not raise his weapon. He did not speak. He simply offered a slow, slight nod of gratitude, a deeply human acknowledgement of the small mercy, before turning his face back toward the endless road and shuffling forward, swallowed once again by the moving tide of gray. The old man returned to the shade of the oak tree, resting his hands on his walking stick. He watched the column disappear into the distance, a long, winding snake of dust stretching toward the horizon. He knew, with the quiet wisdom of a man who has watched many seasons turn, that the giant was breaking. It was cracking under the weight of its own terrible ambition. When the sun finally began to sink, bleeding a brilliant, fiery orange across the flat earth, the order to halt was given. The relief was immediate, but it was a heavy, exhausted relief. The men did not cheer. They simply collapsed into the tall grass beside the road, too tired to speak, too tired to even unpack their bedrolls. The silence of the steppe, vast and absolute, rushed in to fill the space left by the marching boots. Lucas lay on his back, staring up as the first pale stars began to prick through the deepening twilight. The earth beneath him still held the warmth of the sun, a gentle, comforting heat against his aching muscles. He pulled his letter from his tunic one last time, needing to feel the connection to the world he had left behind. "We are moving forward, Clara," he whispered into the quiet dark, the words for his letter forming only in his mind. "We are winning the battles. But the land is swallowing us whole. Every step we take away from home feels like a step deeper into a dream we cannot wake from. I look around at my friends, and I see how thin they have become. The fire is gone from their eyes. The generals tell us we are invincible, but out here, in the tall grass, we are only tired boys waiting for the end of the road." He slipped the paper back into his pocket and closed his eyes. The great machine was still moving, but the myth of the unbroken steppe was dead. It had been buried in the fine, choking dust of the summer plains. The soldiers had looked into the infinite vastness of the east, and they had realized the terrifying truth. They could not conquer the horizon. As the night settled over the sleeping army, wrapping them in a cool, starry blanket, the whispering steppes seemed to breathe a sigh of patient relief. The land had absorbed the shock of the invasion, taking the heavy blows of the Iron Giant and simply expanding to hold them. The cracks were there, hidden beneath the uniforms and the propaganda, showing in the blistered heels, the coughing engines, and the letters filled with quiet despair. The summer was ending. The golden week had been turned to ash, and the long march had drained the life from the conquerors. They were stretched so incredibly thin across the face of the earth, a fragile thread of exhausted humanity holding on to an impossible dream. And as they slept in the deep, quiet dark, the earth simply waited, knowing that the nights were slowly growing longer, and that the true test of their endurance was only just beginning to stir in the cold winds gathering far to the north. The first snowflake did not fall with a heavy crash, yet it was the heaviest thing the Iron Giant had ever tried to carry. It drifted down from a sky the color of bruised pearl, tiny and delicate, landing softly against the dark, cold metal of a resting machine. It was followed by another, and then another, a gentle, whispering descent that seemed entirely harmless. But in the vast, open expanses of the east, the snow does not simply fall. It settles. It accumulates. And it waits. For months, the great, roaring tide of the conquerors had pushed forward, driven by a relentless, burning momentum. They had crossed rivers and rolled through ancient forests, entirely convinced that their speed could outrun the turning of the earth itself. They had believed the grand, echoing speeches of their leaders, the promises that they would be sitting by warm hearths long before the leaves had finished falling from the trees. But a machine, no matter how perfectly engineered, cannot negotiate with the seasons. As the autumn rains turned the deep, unpaved roads into a boundless sea of thick, heavy mud, the great advance had begun to stagger. The earth had grabbed hold of the spinning tires and the grinding tracks, slowing the lightning-fast army to an exhausting, muddy crawl. And then, as if the land itself were taking a deep, freezing breath, the temperature plummeted. The mud hardened into jagged, solid ruts of ice. The landscape, once a sea of vibrant green and then a sea of brown, was swiftly buried under an endless, blinding blanket of pure, unbroken white. To understand the profound humbling of this moment, we must look away from the grand maps and look into the quiet, shivering dark of a winter night. We must look at the exact point where the unbreakable ambition of man finally met the silent, immovable wall of nature. In a small, shallow trench dug desperately into the frozen earth, a young soldier named Friedrich sat with his knees pulled tightly against his chest. He was wearing a uniform made for a summer parade, a thin fabric that offered no shelter against the biting, invisible teeth of the wind. He had wrapped a torn, wool scarf around his head, and his feet were stuffed with crumpled newspaper in a desperate, fragile attempt to keep his toes from turning to ice. Friedrich was an artist before he was a soldier. He loved the gentle curve of a charcoal line, the warmth of the sun on a canvas, the soft, golden light of his hometown in the late afternoon. Now, his world was drawn entirely in stark, merciless shades of silver and gray. He held a small, stubby pencil in his heavily mittened hand, clumsy and numb, trying to write a letter to his young wife. The paper rested on his knee, illuminated only by the faint, ghostly glow of the moon reflecting off the snowdrifts. "My dearest Clara," he wrote, his hand shaking so violently that the letters looked like the jagged tracks of a lost bird. "The silence here is so loud it rings in my ears. I am looking out over a field of white, and it seems to stretch on forever, right into the stars. We were told we were an unstoppable force, but the wind does not care about our uniforms or our pride. The wind simply blows. I close my eyes and try to remember the smell of the cinnamon rolls baking in your mother's kitchen. I try to remember the feeling of the fire warming the rug in our parlor. It is the only thing keeping the blood moving in my chest. We have stopped marching, my love. The earth has told us we can go no further." Friedrich tucked the fragile piece of paper into his breast pocket, close to his beating heart. He did not feel like a conqueror. He felt like a very small, very tired boy who had wandered too far into the deep woods, completely at the mercy of the falling snow. This was the quiet, devastating tragedy of the winter. The leaders far away in their heated rooms, sitting in plush velvet chairs and drinking warm tea, refused to acknowledge the frost. They set orders to push forward, entirely blind to the fact that they were ordering flesh to fight against the absolute cold. And it was not only the flesh that was failing. The metal, the very pride of the unstoppable machine, was surrendering to the deep freeze. The great engines, which had roared across the continent with such terrifying, deafening power, were slowly being choked into silence. The thick oil that lubricated their gears turned to a dark, unyielding tar. The metal itself became brittle, snapping like dry twigs under the sheer stress of the dropping temperature. In the dim, blue light of the early morning, mechanics with frostbitten fingers tried desperately to light small fires directly beneath the bellies of the massive tanks, hoping to thaw the frozen blood of the machines. But the cold was absolute. It absorbed the heat of the tiny flames as easily as the ocean absorbs a single raindrop. The mighty vehicles, designed to move faster than human thought, became nothing more than heavy, useless blocks of freezing iron. They sat half buried in the snowdrifts, their dark barrels pointed blindly at an empty horizon, looking like ancient monuments to a forgotten, arrogant age. The momentum that had shattered the world was entirely gone, swallowed by the quiet, creeping ice. While the invading army shivered in the dark, bewildered and broken by the harshness of the sky, the people of the vast eastern land retreated into the comforting, familiar embrace of their own winter. For the locals, the frost was not an enemy. It was a harsh, demanding elder, a force they had respected and prepared for their entire lives. They knew how to survive when the world turned to ice. In a small, wooden cabin nestled at the edge of a snow-heavy pine forest, an older woman named Katerina was gently stoking the fire in her large, brick stove. The stove was the very heart of the home, a massive, warm presence that radiated a slow, steady heat through the thick timber walls. The cabin smelled of dried herbs, burning birch wood, and the deep, earthy scent of stored root vegetables. Katerina wore thick, felted boots and a heavy woolen shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, respecting the energy required to live in the deep cold. She was boiling a small pot of water to make tea from dried raspberry leaves, a sweet, fragrant reminder of the summer sun. She walked to her small, frost-covered window and scraped a tiny circle of clear glass with her thumbnail. She looked out into the glittering, freezing night. She knew the invaders were out there, stalled in the snow, freezing in their thin coats and their broken metal boxes. Katerina did not feel a burning, fiery hatred in that moment. She felt a profound, heavy sorrow for the sheer folly of it all. She knew, with the deep, ancestral wisdom of the steppe, that the earth always protects her own, and that she is merciless to those who try to conquer her without respect. They did not ask the winter for permission, she whispered softly to herself, her breath briefly fogging the cold glass. She turned back to her warm stove, pouring the steaming, rosy tea into 2 small, ceramic cups. She handed one to her young grandson, who was sitting on the woven rug, wrapping his hands happily around the warm clay. It was a tiny, beautiful moment of everyday survival. While the greatest army the world had ever seen was being paralyzed by the elements, a grandmother and her grandson were simply sitting by the fire, drinking tea, safe in the deeply rooted knowledge of how to weather the storm. The psychological shift along the frozen lines was profound. The myth of the unbroken steppe, the grand illusion of supreme invincibility, finally cracked and shattered in the sub-zero air. The soldiers from the west, huddled together in the deep snow, began to realize that the universe was infinitely larger and far more indifferent than they had ever been taught. When you are sitting in a trench, watching your own breath freeze and fall like snow onto your collar, the grand speeches of dictators mean absolutely nothing. The silence of the Russian winter is a heavy, majestic thing. It is not an empty silence, it is a silence filled with the weight of the falling snow, the occasional sharp crack of a freezing tree branch, and the low, mournful howling of the wind moving across the flat, open plains. In this vast, echoing quiet, the conquerors were forced to listen to their own frail heartbeats. They realized, with a quiet, creeping dread, that they were entirely out of their depth. They had brought weapons of fire and steel to fight a war of endurance against the ice, and the ice was winning without shedding a single drop of blood. In the darkest hours of the night, when the temperature reached its most punishing depths, the lines between enemies began to blur in the minds of the freezing men. Friedrich lay in his shallow hole, pressed back to back with another young soldier, trying to share the faint, fading warmth of their bodies. He looked up at the sky. The clouds had parted, revealing a canopy of stars so bright, so violently beautiful and cold, that they seemed to pierce the eyes. He did not think of victory. He did not think of the capital city that lay somewhere in the distance, hidden behind the snowdrifts. He thought only of the morning. He thought of the gentle, fragile hope of seeing the sun rise, of feeling just a fraction of warmth on his numb face. He reached out a trembling hand and gently patted the shoulder of the boy sleeping next to him, a small, quiet gesture of solidarity in the face of the overwhelming dark. Just until morning, Friedrich whispered into the freezing air, his voice barely carrying over the sound of the wind. "We just have to hold on until the morning." The great machine had finally ground to a halt. The limitless ambition that had swallowed the borders of Europe had been entirely arrested by the quiet, unyielding forces of nature. The limits of flesh and metal had been reached, and the winter had drawn a hard, white line across the earth that no engine could cross. It was a profound humbling. The giant had been brought to its knees not by a louder roar, but by a perfect, absolute silence. As the snow continued to fall, gently covering the stalled tanks, burying the frozen roads, and blanketing the tired, shivering boys in a deep, heavy slumber, the world seemed to hold its breath. The terrifying speed of the early years was gone, replaced by the slow, agonizing crawl of survival. The long, dark night of the winter had arrived, and beneath the indifferent gaze of the brilliant stars, the invaders could do nothing but wrap their thin coats tighter, close their heavy eyes, and pray for the dawn. The snow had finally stopped falling, leaving behind a silence so deep it felt as though the very rotation of the earth had paused to rest. It is a strange and profound thing, to stand in the middle of the longest night of the year. The air is entirely still, sharp and biting against the cheeks, and the sky above is a vast, unblinking canopy of cold, brilliant stars. To look out across the continent in this deep, freezing midnight was to look upon a world that had been completely, unimaginably transformed. The sweeping storm that had rushed across the green fields and ancient cobblestones was over. The violent, rushing winds of the early days had settled, replaced by a heavy, breathless frost that held the broken world perfectly in place. As we look back at the sudden, terrifying shadow that swallowed the sun so quickly, we can finally begin to understand the illusion of the early years. The great machine had succeeded not because it was truly invincible, but because it had moved with the blinding, disorienting speed of a lightning strike in a dark room. It had weaponized the world's deep, desperate exhaustion. It had charged against the quiet, gentle people who simply wanted to be left alone to tend their gardens and raise their children in peace. The conquerors had mistaken that beautiful, weary desire for peace as a fatal weakness. They had used overwhelming noise, sudden terror, and the sheer audacity of moving faster than human grief to trick the world into believing the night would last forever. They painted a picture of an empire carved from unbreakable iron, an unstoppable force that could simply fold the horizons and erase the ancient borders of the earth. But as the snow settled over the stalled tanks in the east, and the fog rolled over the quiet, occupied harbors of the north, the truth began to quietly reveal itself in the dark. A sudden conquest is a shallow thing. You can lay a heavy blanket of gray over a map in a matter of weeks, but you cannot conquer the deep, beating heart of the earth beneath it. In a narrow, drafty apartment overlooking a silent river in a captive city, a woman named Amelie stood in her freezing kitchen. The windows were covered in heavy, black paper, completely sealing the room away from the street outside. The city that had once sparkled with thousands of electric lights and echoed with the laughter of crowded cafes was now a ghost ship adrift in the dark, forced into a strict, suffocating slumber by the men who patrolled the streets below. Amelie was wrapped in a thick, woolen shawl that smelled faintly of lavender and old cedar. Her hands, pale and trembling slightly in the chill, struck a small, wooden match against the stone counter. With a soft, scratching hiss, a tiny spark bloomed into a gentle, golden tear of fire. She touched it to the wick of a small, white candle resting in a ceramic saucer. As the flame caught, pushing back the absolute darkness of the room, Amelie let out a long, slow breath. She did not light the candle to read, or to warm her hands. She lit it as a quiet, sacred promise. She pulled a worn wooden chair to the table and sat within the small, warm circle of light. She closed her eyes and simply remembered. She remembered the smell of fresh bread baking in the shop down the lane. She remembered the sound of her husband's footsteps on the wooden stairs, a sound she had not heard since the autumn. She remembered the color of the sky before it was filled with the roar of strange engines. This was the quiet, everyday heroism that the conqueror could never understand. The giant had built a machine designed to crush armies, but it had entirely failed to calculate the stubborn, enduring resilience of memory. The heavy toll of the early years was measured not just in fallen architecture, but in the profound, aching homesickness felt by millions of people who had never even left their homes. Their world had been taken away from them, replaced by a cold, rigid order that demanded total submission. But Amelie, sitting in the golden glow of her single candle, was not submitting. By simply refusing to forget the warmth of the sun, by tending to the fragile, beautiful flame of her own humanity, she was fighting a war the occupier could not see. She was keeping the inner light burning. She knew that as long as the memory of the morning survived in the quiet rooms of the city, the night had not truly won. Thousands of miles away, on the endless, frozen plains of the east, the illusion of the sudden conquest was meeting its final, devastating limit. A young soldier, wrapped in layers of stolen blankets and shivering uncontrollably in the bottom of a snow-filled trench, looked out at the absolute nothingness of the steppe. The magnificent, unstoppable momentum that had carried him away from his home had frozen solid. The iron tracks of the great machines were locked in the ice. The loud, arrogant speeches of his commanders felt like absurd, distant echoes in the face of the overwhelming, majestic indifference of the winter. He was a boy who had been promised a quick, glorious victory, a boy who had been told he was part of a storm that would reshape the world. But looking up at the merciless, glittering stars, he realized the heartbreaking truth. The storm had simply blown itself out against the sheer, impossible scale of the earth. He reached into his coat with numb, clumsy fingers and touched a letter from his mother. It was crumpled and worn from being read 100 times. He did not need to open it in the dark, he knew the words by heart. She had written about the apple tree in their backyard, how it was heavy with fruit, how she was saving the sweetest ones for his return. A single, hot tear traced a path down his freezing cheek. The grand, terrifying empire he had marched for meant absolutely nothing to him now. He did not want to be a conqueror. He only wanted to be a son again. He only wanted to sit in a warm kitchen and listen to the rain. The machine had stretched itself so thin, reaching so far into the dark, that its own heartbeat was failing. The hubris of believing you can outrun the seasons, that you can bend the ancient laws of nature to the will of a cold ideology, was finally being answered by the profound, crushing silence of the snow. The early years of swift, easy victories were over. The long, agonizing reality of a broken world had arrived. But even as the shadow stretched to its absolute limit, the fragile, beautiful threads of human connection refused to snap. Deep beneath a quiet house in the countryside, far from the frozen trenches and the occupied cities, a father and his young son sat huddled in a damp root cellar. The air smelled of earth and stored potatoes. In the center of the small room, sitting on a wooden crate, was an old, heavy radio set. The father carefully adjusted a long piece of copper wire, stringing it across the wooden joists of the ceiling. He turned the heavy, bakelite dial with incredible slowness, his ear pressed close to the fabric speaker. The radio hissed and popped. It was the sound of static, the sound of the vast, empty distances between the stars. The occupier had demanded that the skies be silent, that the airwaves carry only the heavy, rigid marching tunes of the new order. They wanted the people to feel completely, hopelessly isolated, cut off from the rest of the world, alone in the dark. But the father kept turning the dial, his hand steady, his eyes focused and calm. And then, faintly, rising through the crackling sea of static, came a sound. It was not a voice of anger, or a speech of defiance. It was the soft, lilting melody of a cello playing an old, familiar waltz. It drifted through the dark cellar like a ghost of the old world, a sweet, soaring note that instantly brought a lump to the father's throat. He pulled his young son close, wrapping a heavy arm around the boy's shoulders. They sat in the dark, bathed in the faint, orange glow of the radio's vacuum tubes, and they listened to the music. That faint, crackling melody was a miracle. It was a lifeline thrown across the continent, an invisible string of notes connecting the isolated, the terrified, and the exhausted. It said, without a single spoken word, "You are not alone. The world is still out here. The music has not died." This is why the great, mechanical shadow could never truly win. It only understood how to break the surface of the world. It understood how to fold the map and lock the doors. But it could not reach into the cellar to stop the music. It could not reach into Amelie's kitchen to blow out her candle. It could not reach into the freezing soldier's heart to steal his memory of the apple tree. As the longest night of the year slowly inches toward the dawn, the world is held in a state of quiet, suspended grace. The terror of the sudden collapse has passed, replaced by the deep, enduring ache of a long winter. The people of the world have learned that the giant is not invincible. They have seen it slip on the wet cobblestones. They have seen it stall in the freezing snow. They have watched its planes fall from the vast blue sky, broken by the quiet determination of a few exhausted boys. The illusion has shattered. The terrifying magic trick is over. And what remains is the simple, breathtaking endurance of the human spirit. Across the darkened continent, millions of everyday people are sitting in their quiet rooms, tending to their inner light. They are sharing small pieces of bread in the hallways. They are knitting warm socks by the fire. They are whispering stories of peace to their sleeping children, painting pictures of a morning that the children can scarcely remember. They are the candles in the longest night. They are small, they are fragile, and they are easily overlooked by the men who march in the heavy boots. But a million small candles, burning together in the deep, freezing dark, is enough to keep the soul of the world warm. The earth continues its slow, steady rotation. The solstice passes in the silence. And though the sky remains black, and the air remains bitter and cold, a profound, invisible shift has occurred in the heavens. From this moment on, the night is no longer growing. The shadows have reached their absolute limit. Every day that follows this one, the light will return to the world, just a fraction of an inch at a time. The sun will rise just a moment earlier, and it will linger just a moment longer. The deep snows will eventually begin to soften. The ice will eventually crack. So rest now. Wrap the heavy blanket tightly around your shoulders, and close your eyes. The storm has done its worst, and the world is still here. Listen to the quiet, steady breathing of the people sleeping around you. Feel the gentle, enduring warmth of the embers in the hearth. The early years of the sorrow have closed, and the longest night is finally behind us. Keep your candle safe from the draft. Hold your memories close to your heart. And simply wait, with quiet, beautiful patience, for the gentle breaking of the dawn.